Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises, or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. In this era, when kings ruled by divine right and peasants lived at the mercy of their lords, mining was perhaps the most perilous occupation one could undertake. Yet for many, it represented the only path to something approaching prosperity, a chance to earn coin rather than scraping bare sustenance from unyielding soil. The irony was cruel and complete. In seeking to rise from poverty, these miners descended literally and figuratively into conditions that would challenge every fibre of their being. The medieval world was a tapestry woven from hardship, but even among the many threads of suffering, the lives of miners stood out in their particular darkness. These were men who traded sunlight for shadow, fresh air for suffocating depths, and the simple pleasure of seeing the sky for the constant companionship of stone walls that could become their tomb without warning. Let us follow one such soul into the depths, a man named Edmund, whose weathered hands have known more coal dust than soil, whose eyes have grown accustomed to torchlight rather than the sun's warm glow. Edmund rises before dawn in his small cottage on the outskirts of a mining village in Derbyshire. The year is 1347, and the world above ground wrestles with war, plague, and political upheaval. But Edmund's concerns are more immediate and more visceral. He breaks his fast on a heel of dark bread and small beer, the same meal he has eaten for countless mornings. His wife, Margaret, presses a bundle containing his midday meal into his calloused hands. A bit more bread, perhaps a sliver of cheese if they have been fortunate, and always the small flask of ale that will be his only comfort in the depths. She does not speak of her fears, for what good would it do? Every kiss goodbye might be their last, every evening reunion, a small miracle. The walk to the mine takes Edmund through the village, past the homes of his fellow miners, past the small church where the priest offers prayers for their safety that seem to echo unheard in the morning air. Other men join him on this silent procession, their faces bearing the particular pallor of those who spend their days away from sunlight. Some cough already, the deep, rattling sound that speaks of lungs slowly surrendering to years of breathing stone dust and stale air. The mine entrance looms before them like the mouth of some ancient beast. Wooden supports frame the opening, but these timbers offer little reassurance. In an age when engineering was more art than science, when safety was a luxury few could afford, these supports represented hope more than security. The rope that will lower Edmund into the darkness is rough hemp, inspected by touch rather than any systematic method. One frayed strand, one weak point, could send a man plummeting to his death. But perhaps the most telling detail of Edmund's morning routine is what he does before entering that dark mouth. He removes his cap and crosses himself, murmuring a prayer to St. Barbara, the patron saint of miners. In a world where faith and superstition intertwined like the roots of ancient trees, these small rituals provided what little comfort could be found. St. Barbara, who according to legend was imprisoned in a tower by her father, seemed a fitting protector for men who would spend their days imprisoned by stone. The descent begins with the grinding of rope through wooden pulleys, a sound that has become as familiar as breathing to these men. Down they go, leaving behind the world of weather and seasons, of birdsong and wind through trees. The temperature drops noticeably as they descend, and the air grows thick and stale. The walls of the shaft, carved from living rock, seem to press closer with each foot of their descent. At the bottom, Edmund's real work begins. In the flickering light of oil lamps and tallow candles, he will spend the next 12 hours attacking the earth with tools that seem pitifully inadequate for the task. His pickaxe, while sharp, is small and light. The hammers and chisels at his disposal would be recognizable to a Roman miner from 1,000 years past. Progress is measured not in tons extracted, but in inches gained, in the slow, methodical chipping away at seams of coal or veins of precious metal. The work is backbreaking in the most literal sense. Miners often worked in spaces so cramped they could not stand upright, spending hour after hour bent double or lying on their sides to reach the coal face. Edmund's spine has developed a permanent curve from years of this posture, and his joints protest with every movement. The young men who enter the mines stand straight and move with easy grace. Those who have been mining for decades can be identified by their gait alone, the careful, measured steps of men whose bodies have been reshaped by their labor. But the physical demands of the work pale beside the constant, gnawing fear that accompanies every moment underground. The earth itself seems alive with malevolent intent. Strange sounds echo through the tunnels, the settling of rock, the drip of underground water, the creaking of wooden supports strained beyond their limits. Every sound might herald disaster. Every vibration could signal the beginning of a cave-in that would bury a man alive. The air Edmund breathes is a cocktail of dangers invisible to the naked eye. Coal dust floats constantly in the stagnant atmosphere, settling in his lungs with each breath. Over time, this dust will accumulate, turning his lungs black and hard, making each breath a struggle. The condition has no name in Edmund's time, but we know it as pneumoconiosis, the black lung disease that claimed the lives of countless miners. It is a slow death, a gradual suffocation that can take decades to complete its work. Water is another constant threat in these underground workings. Spring rains and winter snows find their way through cracks in the earth, pooling in the lowest levels of the mine. Edmund often works standing in water up to his ankles, sometimes deeper. His feet are perpetually cold and damp, and the wet conditions breed all manner of infections and ailments. Proper drainage requires engineering expertise and resources that few medieval mines possessed. The lighting in these subterranean workshops is perhaps the most telling indicator of the era's technological limitations. Edmund's workspace is illuminated by candles made from animal fat, their flames dancing with every current of air and casting wild shadows on the tunnel walls. These flames provide barely enough light to see the immediate work area, leaving the tunnels beyond shrouded in a darkness so complete it seems to have weight and substance. Oil lamps, while slightly more reliable than candles, are expensive and produce their own hazards. The open flames that provide the only light are themselves a danger in an environment where pockets of explosive gas can accumulate without warning. Methane, the product of decomposing organic matter, seeps from coal seams and collects in low-lying areas of the mine. A single spark, a candle flame that burns too close to a gas pocket, can trigger an explosion that will kill every man in the tunnel and perhaps bring down the entire working. Edmund has seen such disasters. He has helped carry out the broken bodies of men who were laughing and joking just hours before. He has comforted widows and fatherless children, knowing that tomorrow it might be Margaret weeping over his own still form. These experiences leave their mark not just on the survivors, but on the entire mining community. Everyone knows someone who has died underground. Everyone has heard the stories of cave-ins that buried men alive, of explosions that left nothing but charred remains. The tools of Edmund's trade tell their own story of hardship and limitation. His pickaxe, while essential, is a simple thing of iron and wood. The metal is soft by modern standards, requiring constant sharpening and frequent replacement. The wooden handle, worn smooth by countless hands, must be replaced regularly as the jarring impact of striking stone splits and weakens the wood. Shovels for moving loose coal and rock are crude affairs. They're blades fashioned by local blacksmiths, who work more from tradition than from any scientific understanding of metallurgy. The wheelbarrows used to transport material through the tunnels are small and flimsy, their wooden wheels apt to break under heavy loads or in the rough conditions of the mine floor. Perhaps most telling of all are the baskets and leather bags used to carry coal and ore to the surface. These containers, woven from whatever materials are available, speak to the hand-to-mouth existence of the mining operation. There are no standardized containers, no systematic approach to moving material. Each miner makes do with whatever he can fashion or afford. The absence of proper ventilation in medieval mines created an environment that was not merely uncomfortable, but actively hostile to human life. The air Edmund breathes has been breathed by dozens of men before him. It carries not just coal dust, but the exhalations of his fellow workers, the smoke from their candles and lamps, and gases seeping from the earth itself. In summer, the stagnant air becomes thick and oppressive, causing men to faint from heat and lack of oxygen. In winter, the contrast between the cold surface air and the relatively warm depths creates its own problems, as moisture condenses on the tunnel walls and drips constantly onto the workers below. Edmund's clothes are perpetually damp, and the chill seeps into his bones during the long climb back to the surface each evening. The lack of fresh air also means that any illness spreads rapidly through the confined space of the mine. A man with a fever or a cough becomes a danger to every other worker, but few can afford to stay home when sick. The daily wage, meagre as it is, represents the difference between eating and going hungry for many mining families. Edmund's workday follows a rhythm as old as mining itself. He begins by examining his section of the tunnel, looking for signs that the earth has shifted during the night. Loose rocks must be cleared away, water must be bailed out of low spots, and the condition of the wooden supports must be assessed. This morning inspection is a ritual that might save his life, for the earth never sleeps, and what was solid yesterday might be treacherous today. The actual work of extracting coal or ore is methodical and exhausting. Edmund positions himself at the coal face, the exposed seam where he will spend most of his day. He begins by undercutting the coal, using his pickaxe to create a horizontal cut at the base of the seam. This technique, while effective, is incredibly dangerous, as it weakens the entire face and increases the likelihood of a sudden collapse. Once the undercut is complete, Edmund must drive wedges into cracks in the coal, hoping to split off large chunks that can be loaded into baskets. The work requires both strength and skill, for a poorly placed blow might shatter the coal into unusable fragments, or worse, trigger a rockfall that could crush him instantly. The loading and transport of the extracted material represents another layer of exhausting labour. The coal must be shoveled into baskets, carried through the narrow tunnels to a central collection point, and then loaded into larger containers for the journey to the surface. In many mines, this transport was accomplished by human power alone. Men and boys would carry baskets of coal on their backs through tunnels barely wide enough for their shoulders, bent double under loads that would challenge a pack animal. The human cost of this transport system was enormous. Boys as young as 8 or 10 were employed as trappers, sitting alone in the darkness for 12 hours at a time, opening and closing doors that controlled airflow through the tunnels. These children, paid a few pence for their long day of isolation and fear, often developed severe psychological problems from their underground imprisonment. Women, too, were employed in the mines, though their work was often different from that of the men. They might sort coal at the surface, separating the valuable material from waste rock, or they might work underground as haulers, pulling carts of coal through the tunnels. The sight of women crawling through dark passages, chains attached to their waists as they dragged heavy loads, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval mining. As the hours pass and Edmund continues his assault on the coalface, his body begins to protest the accumulated strain of years spent in this underground hell. His back aches constantly, the result of working in cramped positions day after day. His hands, protected only by rough leather gloves, are cut and bleeding from handling sharp tools and rough stone. His knees, worn raw from crawling through low tunnels, send sharp pains through his legs with every movement. The constant noise of the mine, the ringing of metal on stone, the creaking of wooden supports, the splash of water dripping from the ceiling, has affected Edmund's hearing. Like many long-time miners, he has developed a persistent ringing in his ears, and he must strain to hear normal conversation. The dust in the air makes his eyes water constantly, and the dim light strains his vision until he suffers from persistent headaches. But perhaps the most insidious damage is being done to Edmund's lungs. With every breath, he inhales microscopic particles of coal dust that settle deep in his lung tissue. Over time, these particles accumulate, causing inflammation and scarring that will eventually make breathing difficult and painful. The cough that has developed over his years of mining grows worse each winter, and he sometimes spits up black phlegm that speaks to the corruption growing within his chest. The social isolation of mining work adds another dimension to the miner's suffering. Spending 12 hours a day underground, Edmund has little contact with the natural world that shapes the lives of other medieval workers. He does not see the changing seasons in the same way as farmers, does not feel the rhythm of planting and harvest that gives structure to agricultural life. His world is one of eternal twilight, where time is measured not by the sun's passage across the sky, but by the guttering of candles and the aching of tired muscles. This separation from the natural world has profound psychological effects. Many miners develop what we might recognize today as depression, a persistent melancholy that seems to seep into their souls like the dampness that permeates the tunnels. They become withdrawn and taciturn, speaking little even to their families. The constant stress of working in dangerous conditions, combined with the physical exhaustion of hard labor, creates a population of men who are old before their time. The economic realities of mining life add yet another layer of hardship to Edmund's existence. While miners might earn slightly more than agricultural laborers, their expenses are also higher. They must purchase their own tools, their own candles and oil for lighting, and often their own food and drink for the long hours underground. The cost of replacing worn-out equipment can quickly consume any extra earnings, leaving mining families as poor as any in medieval society. Moreover, the boom and bust nature of mining means that steady employment is never guaranteed. A mine might play out suddenly, leaving dozens of men without work. Market conditions for coal or metal ore could change overnight, making previously profitable mines uneconomical to operate. Edmund has experienced these sudden unemployment periods, times when his family survived on charity and whatever work Margaret could find doing laundry or spinning wool for more prosperous neighbours. The company store system, while not as developed in medieval times as it would become in later centuries, still trapped many mining families in cycles of debt. Miners often bought their supplies on credit from their employers, accumulating debts that could never quite be paid off. This system ensured a steady supply of workers while keeping them bound to the mine through financial obligations they could not escape. The housing provided for mining families reflects the low value placed on their lives and comfort. Edmund's cottage is typical of miners' housing, a single room with earthen floor, rough stone walls, and a leaking thatch roof. There is no glass in the single window, just wooden shutters that must be closed against the weather, plunging the interior into darkness. The entire family, Edmund, Margaret, and their 3 surviving children, share this cramped space with whatever animals they might own. The cottage sits in a row of similar structures, hastily built and poorly maintained. The lack of proper sanitation means that waste accumulates around the buildings, creating breeding grounds for disease. Wells are often contaminated by runoff from the mines and the privies, making clean water a constant concern. The mortality rate in mining communities is significantly higher than in agricultural villages, reflecting the combined effects of dangerous work, poor living conditions, and environmental contamination. Children in mining families face a particularly grim future. Boys know from an early age that they will likely follow their fathers into the mines, beginning as young as possible to supplement the family income. Education is a luxury that few mining families can afford, as children's labour is needed both in the home and, eventually, in the mines themselves. Girls face the prospect of marriage to miners, condemning them to a life of constant worry and frequent widowhood. The life expectancy of miners is significantly lower than that of other workers, meaning that many women will bury multiple husbands over the course of their lives. These women must be prepared to work themselves, as mining families cannot survive on a single income, and the death or disability of the primary breadwinner means immediate destitution. The medical care available to mining families is minimal and often counterproductive. The local physician, if there is one, has no understanding of the occupational diseases that plague miners. Edmund's persistent cough is attributed to bad humours, or miasma, from the underground air, and the prescribed treatments, bloodletting, purging, and various herbal concoctions, do nothing to address the underlying lung damage caused by coal dust inhalation. Injuries sustained in the mines are treated with whatever folk remedies are available. Broken bones are set without proper knowledge of anatomy, often healing crooked and causing permanent disability. Cuts and abrasions, constantly exposed to the dirty conditions of the mine, frequently become infected. Many miners bear the scars of accidents that would have been fatal without immediate medical attention that simply was not available. The psychological toll of mining work extends beyond the individual miners to their entire families. Children grow up knowing that their father might not return home each evening, creating an atmosphere of constant anxiety. Wives develop a particular form of stress-related illness, manifesting in sleeplessness, digestive problems, and what medieval medicine would call nervous disorders. The mining community develops its own culture of mutual support, born from shared hardship. Miners look out for each other underground, sharing food and water, helping injured colleagues reach the surface, and maintaining the unspoken bonds that might mean the difference between life and death in an emergency. But this solidarity is born from desperation rather than choice, and it exists alongside competition for the best working areas and conflicts over pay and working conditions. As Edmund's workday finally draws to a close, the journey back to the surface begins. The climb up the rope or ladder to ground level is exhausting after 12 hours of hard labour, but it also represents a daily rebirth, a return to the world of light and air. The first breath of fresh air, the first glimpse of sky, brings a moment of relief that is quickly tempered by the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another descent into darkness. The evening routine in Edmund's cottage is simple and brief. Margaret helps him wash the coal dust from his hands and face with precious water carried from the village well. The black grime seems to have penetrated his very pores, and no amount of scrubbing can entirely remove the evidence of his underground labour. His fingernails are permanently black, his hair carries the scent of coal smoke, and his clothes are stained beyond any hope of cleaning. The evening meal, like the morning breakfast, is simple and meagre. A bowl of pottage made from whatever vegetables Margaret could grow in their small garden, perhaps supplemented with a bit of bacon if they have been fortunate. The family eats in relative silence, for Edmund is too exhausted for conversation, and the children have learned not to disturb their father's brief rest. Before sleep, Edmund often sits for a few minutes outside his cottage, breathing the clean evening air and looking up at stars that seem impossibly bright after a day in the underground darkness. These moments of peace are precious and brief, for dawn will come early and with it another day in the depths. Margaret watches her husband during these quiet interludes, noting how he has aged beyond his years, how his breathing has become laboured, how his shoulders have developed a permanent stoop from years of working in cramped conditions. The bedroom, such as it is, consists of a straw mattress shared by the entire family. Privacy is unknown in mining families, and Edmund's exhausted sleep is often interrupted by the coughing and movement of his children. His own cough has grown worse lately, and he tries to muffle it so as not to wake the others. But Margaret lies awake, listening to the laboured breathing that tells her Edmund's time may be running short. The seasonal rhythms that govern the lives of farmers and other outdoor workers have little meaning for Edmund. Winter and summer alike, he spends his days in the unchanging environment of the mine. The only seasonal variation comes in the difficulty of getting to and from work. Winter snow and ice making the journey treacherous. Summer heat making the return to the surface particularly difficult after hours in the cool depths. Holiday celebrations in mining communities are subdued affairs. Christmas and Easter may bring a day off from work, but these respites are often overshadowed by the knowledge that lost wages mean even leaner meals in the days to come. The church offers spiritual comfort, but the priest's sermons about the nobility of hard work and the rewards of the afterlife ring hollow to men who face death daily for wages that barely sustain life. The mine owner, a distant figure who may never set foot underground, views his workers as little more than tools to be used up and replaced. The concept of worker safety or occupational health is entirely foreign to medieval thinking. If men die in cave-ins or from lung disease, there are always others desperate enough to take their places. The economic calculation is simple and brutal. Human labour is cheap and replaceable, while safety measures cost money and reduce profits. Record-keeping in medieval mines is minimal, so the true toll of mining work is largely unknown. Men simply disappear, killed in accidents, dead from lung disease, or moved on in search of better opportunities that rarely materialize. Their stories are not recorded, their contributions not acknowledged, their sacrifices quickly forgotten by all except their families. The technological limitations of the medieval period mean that mining will remain dangerous and unhealthy for centuries to come. The steam engines that will eventually pump water from mines and provide ventilation are still hundreds of years in the future. The safety lamps that will reduce the risk of explosions will not be invented for another 4 centuries. The understanding of occupational disease and the development of protective equipment belongs to an unimaginably distant future. For Edmund and his fellow miners, each day underground is a gamble with death. They know the risks, understand the dangers, but have no choice but to accept them. The alternative, starvation, is more certain and immediate than the possibility of cave-ins or explosions. So, they descend each morning into the earth's dark embrace, carrying their small lights against the overwhelming darkness, their hope against the crushing weight of stone and circumstance. As we follow Edmund through his daily routine, we begin to understand that medieval mining was not simply a dangerous occupation, but a form of slow martyrdom. These men sacrificed their health, their longevity, and often their lives not for glory or great reward, but for the simple necessity of feeding their families. They were the anonymous heroes of their age, whose labour provided the coal that heated homes and the metals that armed knights, yet whose names are lost to history. The darkness that claimed so much of their lives seems to have swallowed their stories as well, leaving us only fragments and shadows to reconstruct their experiences. But in understanding their hardships, we gain a deeper appreciation for the true cost of the medieval world's modest prosperity. Every piece of coal that warmed a noble's hall, every iron tool that worked a field, every silver coin that changed hands in market transactions represented not just commercial value, but human suffering on a scale that challenges our comprehension. Edmund's story, multiplied by thousands across medieval Europe, reminds us that progress often comes at a terrible price, paid not by those who benefit most, but by those who have no choice but to pay it. In the flickering candlelight of the mine tunnels, in the labored breathing of men whose lungs are slowly turning to stone, in the worried faces of wives who kiss their husbands goodbye each morning not knowing if they will return, we see the true foundation upon which medieval civilization rested. The earth itself seemed to hunger for these men, drawing them into its depths and slowly consuming them, leaving behind only the coal and ore that would fuel the fires and forge the tools of a world that rarely paused to consider the human cost of its modest comforts. As Edmund finally succumbs to sleep in his cramped cottage, his breathing labored and his body worn beyond his years, we can only marvel at the quiet heroism of ordinary people who faced extraordinary hardships with dignity and endurance that shames our own small complaints. Tomorrow will bring another descent into darkness, another day of wrestling with stone and shadow, another small victory in the endless battle between human need and the earth's reluctant generosity. The cycle will continue until Edmund's body finally surrenders to the accumulated damage of years underground, and another man will take his place at the coalface, carrying forward the ancient compact between desperation and determination that defines the miner's life. In this harsh world of stone and shadow, where life was measured not in years but in the depth of one's cough and the steadiness of one's hand, these forgotten men carved out not just coal and ore, but a legacy of endurance that echoes still in the dark places of human memory. Why life was harsh for medieval miners. History for Sleep, Part 2. As dawn broke over the medieval countryside, the sound of picks striking stone echoed from the depths of the earth. Deep beneath the rolling hills of England and Wales, men like Edmund continued their endless battle against the unforgiving rock face. But the dangers they faced went far beyond the immediate threat of falling stones or suffocating air. The very nature of medieval mining created a web of hazards that ensnared every soul who dared to venture into those dark tunnels. The tools at Edmund's disposal were primitive by any measure. His pick was little more than an iron head crudely hammered onto a wooden handle, the metal often brittle and prone to shattering against particularly stubborn veins of ore. When his pick broke, which happened with alarming frequency, Edmund would be forced to continue his work with whatever makeshift implements he could fashion from broken handles and scraps of metal. The wooden supports that held back tons of earth above his head were equally unreliable, hewn from whatever timber could be found locally, and often green or rotting from the perpetual dampness that plagued these underground workings. Lighting in the mines was perhaps the most treacherous aspect of all. Edmund carried with him a small oil lamp, its flame flickering precariously in the shifting air currents that moved through the tunnels like the breath of some sleeping giant. This tiny flame was his lifeline, his only defense against the absolute darkness that would claim him if it were extinguished. But fire in a mine was a double-edged sword. The very tool that allowed him to see his work also posed the constant threat of igniting the mysterious gases that seeped from the earth. Miners spoke in hushed tones of the fire damp, invisible vapors that could turn a man's lamp into an instrument of his own destruction. When fire damp ignited, the explosion was swift and merciless. Men working dozens of yards away would feel the earth shake beneath their feet, followed by a terrible silence that spoke of lives snuffed out in an instant. The lucky ones died quickly in the initial blast. Others found themselves trapped behind walls of collapsed stone, their lamps extinguished, facing a slow death in the absolute darkness as their air ran out. Some survivors told tales of hearing the faint tapping of trapped miners for days after a cave-in, the sound growing weaker and more desperate until it finally stopped altogether. The air itself was an enemy in these medieval mines. what oxygen existed in the deeper tunnels was often poisoned by the gradual accumulation of noxious gases. Carbon monoxide, invisible and odorless, would creep through the workings like a silent assassin. Miners would notice their companions becoming sluggish and confused, their movements growing clumsy and their speech slurred before they collapsed entirely. Those who recognized the signs would attempt to drag their stricken friends to the surface, but often it was too late. The lucky ones would revive in the fresh air above ground, their heads pounding and their memories clouded. The unlucky ones never woke up at all. Then there was the black damp, another invisible killer that displaced the breathable air in the deepest workings. Unlike the explosive fire damp, black damp killed through suffocation, creating pockets of dead air where no flame could burn and no man could breathe. Miners would lower their lamps ahead of them as they worked, watching carefully for the telltale flickering that warned of bad air. When the flame began to gutter and die, they knew they had reached the boundary between life and death. Water was another constant adversary in the medieval mine. During the rainy seasons, the tunnels would flood with alarming speed, trapping miners in rapidly filling chambers. The primitive drainage systems of the time, consisting mainly of hand-dug channels and buckets hauled by rope, were woefully inadequate against the volume of water that could pour into a mine during a heavy storm. Edmund had lost count of how many times he had found himself wading through knee-deep, ice-cold water, his lamp held high above his head as he struggled to reach higher ground before the rising flood could claim him. Even when the mines weren't actively flooding, the perpetual dampness created its own set of problems. The wooden support timbers would rot and weaken, sometimes giving way without warning and bringing down sections of tunnel roof. The constant moisture also bred disease, creating the perfect environment for the lung ailments that plagued every miner. Edmund's chest had long since developed the characteristic wheeze that marked a man of his profession, a harsh rattling sound that grew worse with each passing year underground. The social isolation of mining life compounded these physical hardships. Mining communities existed on the margins of medieval society, viewed with a mixture of necessity and distrust by the broader population. The work was considered base and degrading, suitable only for those who had no other options. Miners were often treated as little better than criminals, their faces permanently stained with coal dust and their hands blackened from their labours. When they emerged from the earth at the end of a long day, they carried with them the smell of the deep places, a mixture of damp stone, metal, and something else that seemed to seep into their very souls. The constant danger created a unique brotherhood among the miners, but it was a brotherhood forged in desperation rather than choice. They looked out for one another because they knew that their survival depended on it. When a man's lamp began to flicker, his companions would share their own light. When someone showed signs of succumbing to bad air, the others would drag him to safety even at the risk of their own lives. But this solidarity was born of necessity rather than genuine affection, and the relationships formed in the darkness of the mines rarely survived the transition to the world above ground. The economic exploitation of medieval miners was systematic and brutal. Most worked not as independent contractors, but as indentured labourers, bound to their employers by debts that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller with each passing year. The company stores that supplied food, tools, and other necessities charged inflated prices that ensured miners could never quite break even. Equipment failures and accidents were charged against the miner's account, as were the costs of any medical treatment they might require. A broken pick or a damaged cart could result in weeks of additional labour to pay off the debt. The physical toll of mining work aged men prematurely. Edmund, though only in his 30s, moved with the careful gait of someone much older. His back, permanently bent from years of working in low tunnels, ached constantly. His hands, scarred and calloused from handling rough stone and metal tools, had lost much of their sensitivity. His hearing, damaged by the constant din of picks against stone and the occasional explosion, required others to speak loudly for him to understand them clearly. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval mining was how it affected the miners' families. Wives and children lived in constant fear, knowing that each day their husband or father descended into the earth might be the last time they saw him alive. Mining accidents were so common that they barely registered as news in the local communities. A cave-in that killed 3 or 4 men would be mourned briefly and then forgotten as the business of survival continued. Widows of miners found themselves in particularly desperate circumstances, as their late husbands' debts often passed to them, leaving them with obligations they could never hope to fulfill. The children of mining families faced limited prospects. Boys were typically pressed into service in the mines as soon as they were physically capable, beginning with simple tasks like hauling carts or tending to the pit ponies that were used to transport materials. They would gradually work their way up to more dangerous tasks as they grew older and stronger. Girls, meanwhile, might find work in the ancillary industries that supported the mines, such as sorting ore or maintaining equipment, but these jobs were scarce and poorly paid. The medieval understanding of occupational safety was virtually non-existent. Accidents were generally attributed to divine will or personal carelessness rather than systemic problems that could be addressed through better practices or equipment. Mine owners had little incentive to invest in safety measures when workers were plentiful and replaceable. The legal system offered no protections for miners, and the concept of workers' compensation was centuries in the future. Medical knowledge of the time was equally inadequate to address the specific health problems associated with mining. The lung diseases that afflicted virtually every long-term miner were poorly understood and often attributed to moral failings or spiritual weakness rather than occupational exposure to dust and gases. Treatment, when available at all, consisted mainly of bloodletting and herbal remedies that did little to address the underlying damage to the miners' respiratory systems. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that many miners were farmers who turned to mining during the winter months when fieldwork was impossible. This created a cycle where men would spend part of the year destroying their health underground, and the rest struggling to work their fields with bodies damaged by their time in the mines. The transition between these different types of work was jarring and difficult, requiring men to constantly adapt to different physical demands and environmental conditions. The psychological impact of mining work was severe, though rarely acknowledged or discussed in medieval times. The constant proximity to death, the claustrophobic conditions underground, and the grinding poverty that characterized most miners' lives created a pervasive sense of hopelessness that affected entire communities. Men who spent their days in darkness often struggled to readjust to the world above ground, becoming withdrawn and morose. The high rates of alcoholism in mining communities were both a cause and a consequence of this psychological distress. Religious life in mining communities reflected the harsh realities of their existence. Prayers were focused on survival rather than prosperity, and local churches often maintained special devotions to saints associated with protection from accidents and sudden death. The medieval church's emphasis on accepting one's lot in life as divinely ordained provided little comfort to miners who watched their friends and family members die in preventable accidents. But it did offer the promise that their suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. The isolation of mining communities also meant that they were often cut off from broader social and economic developments. While the rest of medieval society was slowly evolving, mining communities remained trapped in patterns of exploitation and hardship that seemed immune to change. News from the outside world filtered in slowly and often in distorted form, leaving miners with little understanding of events beyond their immediate vicinity. The environmental impact of medieval mining was devastating but localized. The landscape around active mines was scarred with open pits, waste heaps, and polluted streams. The air quality in mining areas was poor, filled with dust and smoke that affected not only the miners themselves, but their families and neighbors. The water supply was often contaminated with runoff from mining operations, leading to additional health problems for the entire community. Despite all these hardships, mining continued to expand throughout the medieval period, driven by the growing demand for metals and coal. The human cost of this expansion was enormous, but it was a cost that society seemed willing to bear as long as it was borne primarily by the poorest and most vulnerable members of the population. The miners themselves had little choice but to continue their dangerous work, trapped by economic necessity and the lack of viable alternatives. The stories of individual miners like Edmund were rarely recorded, their lives and deaths noted only in the crude records kept by mine owners to track their workforce. But occasionally, fragments of their experiences survive in legal documents, church records, or the accounts of visitors to mining areas. These glimpses reveal lives of extraordinary hardship and remarkable resilience, of men who faced impossible odds with a determination that speaks to the fundamental human capacity for endurance. As we drift off to sleep in our comfortable beds, warmed by heating systems that pose no threat to our safety and breathing air that we take for granted as clean and safe, it's worth remembering Edmund and the countless men like him who paid such a terrible price for the metals and fuel that built medieval civilization. Their sacrifices were largely unrecognized in their own time, their suffering seen as simply the natural order of things. But their stories remind us of how far we have come and how much we owe to those who came before us, toiling in darkness so that we might live in the light. The medieval miner's tale is one of human endurance in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, of communities bound together by shared hardship, and of the terrible cost of progress measured in human lives. As the night settles around us and we close our eyes, we can honor their memory by acknowledging their struggles and remembering that our modern comforts were built upon foundations laid by hands that never knew the luxury of safety or security. In their silent courage and stubborn persistence, we find a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit, even in the darkest and most dangerous of places. Here is part 3 of the 12-part script for Why Life Was Harsh for Medieval Miners. History for Sleep. As we've seen, the daily existence of medieval miners like Edmund was fraught with immediate physical dangers and health hazards, but their struggles extended far beyond the confines of the underground tunnels. The very communities these miners called home were shaped by the harsh realities of their profession, creating a cycle of hardship that touched every aspect of their lives. Picture the mining settlements that dotted the medieval landscape. These were not the picturesque villages we might imagine from fairy tales, but grimy, soot-covered clusters of ramshackle dwellings built around the gaping mouths of mine shafts. The air itself seemed permanently stained with coal dust, settling on everything like a fine black snow that never melted. Children grew up breathing this tainted atmosphere, their lungs darkening before they could even speak their first words. The miners' homes were modest affairs at best, often little more than single-room structures where entire families huddled together for warmth. The walls, built from whatever materials could be scrounged locally, offered little protection against the bitter winds that swept across the exposed mining sites. Windows were small and few, partly to conserve heat, but also because glass was a luxury far beyond most miners' means. Instead, oiled cloth or wooden shutters kept out the worst of the elements, though they also kept out much of the precious daylight. Inside these humble dwellings, the evidence of the miner's profession was everywhere. Coal dust clung to every surface, worked its way into clothing and bedding, and left its mark on the faces and hands of every family member. No amount of scrubbing could completely remove the black stains that seemed to seep into the very pores of the skin. The miners' wives spent countless hours trying to keep their homes clean, but it was a losing battle against the ever-present dust that drifted in from the nearby workings. The social structure of these mining communities reflected the broader inequalities of medieval society, but with its own particular harsh edges. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the ordinary miners, men like Edmund who descended into the earth each day with nothing but their strength and determination to sustain them. Above them were the skilled craftsmen who maintained the equipment and supervised the more dangerous operations. These men commanded slightly better wages and marginally safer working conditions, though they were still far from comfortable by any measure. At the top of the local social order were the mine owners and their agents, men who rarely if ever set foot underground, but who controlled every aspect of the miners' lives. These wealthy landowners lived in grand houses well away from the mining sites, their comfort built quite literally on the backs of the men who toiled in the darkness below. They viewed their workers as little more than expendable resources, easily replaced when injury or death claimed another victim. The economic relationship between miners and their employers was brutally simple and utterly one-sided. Miners were typically paid by the amount of coal or ore they extracted, a system that encouraged dangerous shortcuts and reckless speed. A cave-in that blocked a tunnel meant no pay for the miners who had been working that section, regardless of whether the collapse was due to their actions or simply the inherent instability of the workings. There were no compensation schemes for injured workers, no support for the widows and children of men killed in mining accidents. This economic vulnerability created a climate of fear that permeated every aspect of miners' lives. A man who complained too loudly about unsafe conditions might find himself blacklisted from work, unable to feed his family. Those who attempted to organize their fellow workers faced even harsher consequences. The authorities viewed any collective action by miners as a threat to the established order, and they were quick to use violence to suppress even the mildest protests. The isolation of mining communities made their situation even more precarious. Located far from major towns and cities, these settlements were cut off from the broader currents of medieval life. News travelled slowly, if at all, and the miners had little knowledge of events beyond their immediate surroundings. This isolation made it easier for mine owners to maintain their control, as workers had few alternatives and little understanding of conditions elsewhere. Trade was virtually non-existent in these communities, as the miners had little to offer beyond their labour and even less money to spend on goods from outside. Most families grew what food they could in small garden plots, supplementing their meagre diet with whatever they could forage from the surrounding countryside. Hunting was often forbidden, as the land typically belonged to the mine owners or local nobility, who jealously guarded their exclusive rights to the game. The children of miners faced a particularly bleak future. Education was virtually unknown in these communities, as there were no schools and no teachers willing to work in such remote and impoverished locations. Most children began working in the mines as soon as they were physically capable, starting with simple tasks like carrying water or tending to the ponies that hauled coal cars through the tunnels. By their teenage years, they would be working alongside their fathers in the deepest and most dangerous parts of the mines. For the daughters of miners, the options were even more limited. While they might avoid the immediate physical dangers of underground work, they faced a lifetime of domestic drudgery in the coal-stained hovels of the mining community. Marriage to another miner was often their only escape from their parents' home, but it merely meant trading one form of hardship for another. The cycle of poverty and suffering continued unbroken from one generation to the next. The health problems that plagued the miners extended to their families as well. The constant exposure to coal dust affected everyone in the community, not just those who worked underground. Respiratory ailments were common among the wives and children of miners, and the contaminated water supplies that served many mining settlements contributed to outbreaks of disease. Medical care was virtually non-existent, as few physicians were willing to serve such remote and impoverished communities. When illness struck a mining family, it often meant financial disaster as well as physical suffering. A miner who could not work earned no wages, and there were no sick benefits or medical insurance to fall back on. Families might be forced to send even younger children into the mines to make up for lost income, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation and endangering another generation. The women of mining communities bore an especially heavy burden. In addition to managing their households under the most difficult conditions, they often took on additional work to supplement their families' meager incomes. Some found employment in the surface operations of the mines, sorting coal or operating simple machinery. Others took in washing from the families of mine supervisors, or attempted to grow extra vegetables to sell to their neighbours. The constant worry about their husbands' and sons' safety added another layer of stress to these women's lives. Every day brought the possibility that their men might not return from the depths, that an accident or cave-in might suddenly leave them widowed and destitute. The sound of the mine's warning bell, used to signal emergencies, could stop the heart of every woman in the settlement. Religious faith provided some comfort to these suffering communities, though even their spiritual lives were marked by the harsh realities of their existence. The local churches, where they existed at all, were often humble structures, built from the same rough materials as the miners' homes. Services were conducted by traveling priests or local men with little formal training, and the message they preached was typically one of acceptance and resignation rather than hope for improvement in this life. The promise of reward in the afterlife for those who endured suffering patiently was a central theme in the religious instruction offered to mining communities. While this may have provided some psychological comfort, it also served to reinforce the social order that kept the miners in their subjugated position. The wealthy mine owners were portrayed as part of God's plan, and resistance to their authority was characterized as sinful rebellion against divine will. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, there were occasional glimmers of human solidarity and mutual support. Miners who had experienced the same dangers and hardships developed strong bonds of brotherhood, sharing what little they had with families struck by tragedy. When a man was killed in a mine accident, his fellow workers might pool their meager resources to help support his widow and children, at least temporarily. These acts of compassion were all the more remarkable, given the scarcity that defined every aspect of life in the mining communities. When everyone was struggling to survive, the decision to share precious food or fuel with a neighbor in need represented a profound act of generosity. These moments of human kindness provided brief respites from the otherwise relentless harshness of daily existence. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural communities had less impact on mining settlements, where work continued regardless of weather or time of year. However, winter brought its own particular hardships as the already difficult living conditions became even more challenging. Fuel for heating was ironically scarce in many mining communities, as the coal they extracted was destined for distant markets rather than local use. The miners and their families often went cold while the fruits of their dangerous labor warmed the homes of wealthy merchants and nobles in far-off cities. This cruel irony was not lost on the miners, who risked their lives daily to extract a commodity they could barely afford to purchase for their own use. As spring arrived and the worst of winter's grip loosened, the mining communities would emerge from their struggle for survival to face another year of the same grinding hardships. The cycle would begin anew, with no prospect of improvement or escape for the vast majority of those trapped in this harsh existence. The environmental damage caused by medieval mining operations created lasting scars on the landscape surrounding these communities. Open pits and spoil heaps dotted the countryside, creating a desolate wasteland where little could grow. The streams and rivers that had once provided clean water became polluted with mining runoff. affecting not only the immediate area, but communities downstream as well. This environmental degradation had profound effects on the health and well-being of mining families. Contaminated water supplies led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases, while the destruction of agricultural land made it even more difficult for families to supplement their diets with homegrown food. The mining operations that provided their only source of income also systematically destroyed the environment they depended on for survival. The noise and disruption caused by mining activities created additional stress for the communities that grew up around them. The constant rumble of machinery, the crash of falling timber, and the shouts of workers created a cacophony that made rest and relaxation nearly impossible. Even at night, when the mines were supposed to be quiet, the sounds of pumps working to keep the tunnels from flooding continued to disturb the sleep of exhausted workers and their families. For the elderly members of mining communities, life was particularly difficult. Those who had spent decades working underground often suffered from severe respiratory problems that made even simple tasks challenging. With no pension systems or social support, these aging miners were entirely dependent on their families for survival. Some continued working until they literally could no longer stand, driven by desperation rather than choice. The presence of aging, disabled miners in the community served as a constant reminder to younger workers of what awaited them if they survived long enough. The bent backs, labored breathing, and premature aging that characterized the older generation provided a glimpse into their own likely futures, adding psychological burden to their already overwhelming physical hardships. As we drift deeper into this exploration of medieval mining communities, we begin to understand how the harsh realities of underground work extended far beyond the mines themselves. The entire social fabric of these settlements was shaped by the dangerous and demanding nature of the work that sustained them. From the coal-stained homes where families struggled to survive, to the environmental devastation that surrounded them, every aspect of life bore the mark of the mining industry's brutal demands. The stories of these communities remind us that the costs of medieval mining were not borne solely by the men who descended into the earth each day. Entire families, entire settlements were caught in the web of hardship and exploitation that characterized this essential but dangerous industry. The coal and metals they extracted helped build medieval civilization, but the human price paid for these resources was enormous and largely hidden from those who benefited from their labors. Medieval miners faced extraordinary perils that would terrify even the bravest souls today. In the flickering candlelight of a 14th century iron mine in the Welsh mountains, a miner named Garrett paused to catch his breath, his lungs burning from the acrid smoke that perpetually filled the narrow tunnels. The simple act of breathing had become a luxury that many of his fellow miners could no longer afford. The underground world of medieval mining was a realm where death lurked around every corner, manifesting in forms both sudden and slow. Cave-ins struck without warning, triggered by the primitive wooden supports that groaned under immense pressure. These crude timber frameworks, hastily erected with whatever materials could be scavenged, offered little more than psychological comfort to the men working beneath tons of unstable rock and earth. Explosions from igniting gases turned mines into underground infernos in an instant. Miners working by the light of oil lamps and open flames had no understanding of the invisible methane and other combustible gases that seeped from the earth around them. A single spark could transform a workplace into a tomb, with flames racing through tunnels faster than any man could run. The lucky ones died quickly. Others faced the horror of being trapped behind walls of fire and smoke, their cries echoing through the darkness until they fell silent forever. The very air that miners breathed was poison. In the depths of coal mines, toxic fumes accumulated in pockets that could kill a man in minutes. Hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, and other deadly gases were invisible killers that claimed lives without warning. Miners developed crude methods of detection, sometimes lowering candles into suspected areas to test for dangerous gases, but these techniques were unreliable at best. Many miners simply held their breath and hoped for the best as they ventured into unknown sections of the mine. Water was another constant enemy. Medieval miners had no effective pumping systems, relying instead on primitive bucket chains and human labor to remove the water that perpetually seeped into their workings. Flooding could occur suddenly, trapping miners in rising water with no means of escape. The dampness also contributed to the collapse of already unstable tunnel walls, creating a cascade of dangers that compounded with each passing day. The tools available to medieval miners were woefully inadequate for the monumental task before them. Iron picks and wooden shovels were the primary instruments of excavation, requiring immense physical effort to break through rock and ore. The constant striking of metal against stone sent shockwaves through miners' arms and shoulders, leading to permanent joint damage and chronic pain. Wheelbarrows and crude sledges were used to transport materials, but the narrow, uneven tunnels made this back-breaking work even more treacherous. Lighting in the mines was perhaps the most dangerous necessity of all. Oil lamps and tallow candles provided the only illumination, but these open flames were a constant fire hazard in an environment filled with combustible materials and gases. The dim, flickering light created deep shadows that concealed hazards and made navigation treacherous. Miners often worked in near-total darkness to conserve precious fuel, feeling their way through tunnels by touch alone. The physical toll of mining extended far beyond immediate injuries. Coal dust accumulated in miners' lungs over years of exposure, leading to a condition known today as pneumoconiosis or black lung disease. Medieval miners called it the miner's curse, a slow suffocation that gradually robbed them of their ability to breathe. They would develop persistent coughs that brought up black phlegm, their breathing becoming increasingly labored until even simple tasks became impossible. Iron and lead mining presented their own unique health hazards. Lead poisoning was common among miners working in lead deposits, causing symptoms ranging from abdominal pain and cognitive impairment to eventual death. The miners had no understanding of these invisible toxins, attributing their declining health to bad air or curses rather than the very materials they were extracting. The cramped working conditions in medieval mines would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. Tunnels were often so narrow that miners had to work on their hands and knees for hours at a time. The constant stooping and crawling led to severe spinal deformities and joint problems that marked miners as a distinct class of workers. Many developed a characteristic hunched posture that they retained even above ground, their bodies permanently shaped by their underground labors. Psychological stress was an overlooked but significant factor in miners' lives. The constant fear of death, combined with the claustrophobic conditions and social isolation from the outside world, took a heavy toll on mental health. Many miners developed what we might now recognize as anxiety disorders or depression, though these conditions were not understood or treated in medieval times. The darkness and confinement drove some to madness, creating additional dangers for their fellow workers. The economic exploitation of miners was as brutal as their working conditions. Most miners were essentially serfs, bound to work for feudal lords who owned the mining rights. They received minimal compensation for their dangerous labor, often paid in food or basic goods rather than money. The lords who profited from mining operations rarely if ever descended into the mines themselves, having no first-hand understanding of the conditions they imposed on their workers. Medical care for injured miners was virtually non-existent. Those who survived accidents were often left permanently disabled with no means of support. A miner who lost a limb or suffered severe injuries faced a choice between starvation and begging. The concept of workplace safety regulations or compensation for injuries would not emerge for centuries. The communities surrounding medieval mines reflected the harsh realities of this dangerous profession. Mining villages were typically squalid settlements built hastily to house workers, with little regard for sanitation or comfort. The constant stream of mining waste created environmental destruction that contaminated water sources and made the land unsuitable for agriculture. These communities lived under a constant pall of dust and smoke, creating unhealthy conditions that affected entire families. Children in mining communities often began working underground at shockingly young ages, sometimes as early as 6 or 7 years old. They were used for tasks considered too dangerous or difficult for adults, such as crawling through narrow passages to clear debris or operating primitive ventilation systems. Child mortality rates in mining communities were astronomical, with many young workers dying before reaching adulthood. Women in mining communities faced their own unique hardships. While they rarely worked underground, they were responsible for maintaining households under extremely difficult conditions, often while their husbands were trapped below ground for days at a time during mining emergencies. The constant threat of widowhood loomed over every miner's wife, and the economic precariousness of mining families meant that a husband's death often spelled disaster for the entire household. The environmental impact of medieval mining was severe and long-lasting. The primitive extraction methods created vast quantities of waste rock and contaminated runoff that poisoned streams and rivers for miles around mining sites. The landscape around active mines was typically barren and scarred, resembling a hellish moonscape that would remain uninhabitable for generations. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval miners developed a strong sense of camaraderie and mutual dependence. The shared dangers of their profession created bonds that were often stronger than family ties. Miners developed their own customs, songs, and traditions that helped them cope with the psychological stress of their work. These underground communities had their own codes of honor and mutual assistance that provided some measure of protection in an otherwise hostile environment. The technological limitations of the medieval period meant that many mining disasters were simply accepted as inevitable. Without effective communication systems, rescue operations were often impossible. Miners trapped by cave-ins or floods were frequently abandoned to their fate, as attempting rescue would only endanger more lives. The philosophy was grimly pragmatic. It was better to lose a few miners than to risk losing many in futile rescue attempts. As we reflect on the brutal realities of medieval mining, we gain a deeper appreciation for the tremendous sacrifices made by these forgotten workers. Their dangerous labor extracted the raw materials that built medieval civilization, from the iron used in tools and weapons to the precious metals that filled royal treasuries. Yet their contributions were rarely acknowledged, and their suffering was largely invisible to the broader society that benefited from their toil. The legacy of medieval mining serves as a stark reminder of how far we have come in terms of workplace safety and workers' rights, while also highlighting the ongoing importance of protecting those who work in dangerous industries. The miners of medieval times faced horrors that no human being should ever have to endure. Yet they persevered with a courage and determination that commands our respect and remembrance. Why life was harsh for medieval miners. History for Sleep, Part 5. Deep beneath the earth, where the sun never reached and the air grew thin with each descending step, Edmund finished another grueling shift in the copper mines of Derbyshire. His lungs burned with each laboured breath, and the persistent cough that had plagued him for months echoed through the narrow tunnel as he made his way toward the surface. At 32 years old, Edmund looked far older than his years, his face weathered by constant exposure to dust, and his body bent from countless hours spent hunched over in cramped mine shafts. The life of a medieval miner was one of perpetual hardship, where each day brought fresh dangers and the promise of an early grave. The mining communities of medieval England were worlds unto themselves, isolated settlements that clung to hillsides and valleys wherever precious metals or coal could be extracted from the earth. These were places where the normal rhythms of agricultural life gave way to something far more perilous and demanding. The miners and their families lived in a constant state of tension, knowing that their livelihood depended on venturing into the bowels of the earth each day, where cave-ins, explosions, and toxic gases claimed lives with frightening regularity. Edmund's village was typical of these mining settlements. Rows of cramped stone cottages lined muddy streets, their walls blackened by the omnipresent coal dust that settled on everything like a fine, choking shroud. The air itself seemed heavy with particles, and even on the clearest days, a haze hung over the community that spoke of the industrial activity below ground. Children played in streets stained black with soot, their games often interrupted by the rumbling sounds of carts hauling ore to the surface, or the ominous creaking of the wooden structures that supported the mine entrances. The social hierarchy in these mining communities was rigid and unforgiving. At the top were the mine owners, often wealthy merchants or minor nobles who had purchased extraction rights from the crown. These men rarely set foot in the actual mines, instead managing their operations from comfortable manor houses located at safe distances from the industrial squalor. Below them were the overseers and foremen, men who had usually worked their way up from the ranks of ordinary miners and now served as the owners' representatives underground. Their job was to ensure maximum production while keeping costs as low as possible, a mandate that often put them at odds with the safety and welfare of the workers under their command. The miners themselves occupied the bottom rung of this hierarchy. They were typically divided into several categories based on their skills and the dangers they faced. The hewers were the most skilled and best paid miners, responsible for cutting coal or ore from the rock face using picks and hammers. This was back-breaking work that required both strength and technique, as a poorly placed blow could bring down a section of tunnel or fail to extract the valuable materials efficiently. The hewers worked in spaces so cramped that they often had to lie on their sides or work in crouched positions for hours at a time, their muscles screaming in protest as they chipped away at the unforgiving stone. Behind the hewers came the haulers, usually younger men or boys, who were responsible for loading the extracted materials into baskets or crude carts and transporting them to the surface. This work was less skilled but no less dangerous, as the haulers had to navigate narrow, poorly lit tunnels while carrying heavy loads. The wooden planks that served as tracks for the carts were often slippery with moisture and debris, and a single misstep could result in serious injury or death. Many haulers worked bent nearly double, pushing or pulling their loads through passages barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through. At the very bottom of the mining hierarchy were the trappers, often children as young as 8 or 9 years old, who were responsible for operating the wooden doors that controlled airflow through the mine tunnels. These children spent their entire working day, sometimes 12 hours or more, sitting alone in complete darkness, opening and closing doors as miners and carts passed through. The isolation was profound and psychologically damaging, and many trappers developed serious mental health issues from spending so much time alone in the suffocating darkness underground. The working conditions in medieval mines were horrifying by any standard. The tunnels were narrow, poorly ventilated, and constantly threatened by structural collapse. Wooden support beams, often made from whatever timber was cheapest and most readily available, groaned ominously under the weight of the earth above. The sound of creaking wood was a constant accompaniment to the miners' work, a reminder that death could come at any moment in the form of a sudden cave-in. Many miners developed an almost supernatural ability to read these sounds, knowing when a particular area was becoming unstable and needed to be evacuated immediately. Ventilation was perhaps the most critical and least addressed problem in medieval mining operations. The deeper the mines went, the more difficult it became to maintain adequate airflow. Toxic gases, including carbon monoxide and methane, could accumulate in poorly ventilated areas, creating invisible death traps for unwary miners. The presence of these gases was often detected only when miners began to feel dizzy or nauseous, by which time it might already be too late. Canaries and other small animals were sometimes used as early warning systems, their deaths serving as alerts that the air had become too poisonous for humans to breathe safely. The threat of explosion was constant in mines where flammable gases were present. A single spark from a pickaxe striking stone, or even the flame from a miner's lamp, could trigger a devastating blast that would kill dozens of workers instantly and collapse entire sections of tunneling. These explosions were particularly feared because they often occurred without warning, giving miners no chance to escape. The bodies of explosion victims were frequently so badly mangled or burned that identification was impossible, leaving families to wonder about the fate of their loved ones. Water was another persistent enemy in medieval mines. Groundwater would seep through cracks in the rock, creating puddles and streams that made working conditions miserable and dangerous. In deeper mines, flooding was a constant threat that could trap miners underground, with no means of escape. The primitive pumping systems available to medieval miners were often inadequate to deal with serious water infiltration, and many mining operations had to be abandoned when the water table rose or when underground springs were accidentally breached. The tools available to medieval miners were crude and inefficient compared to modern standards. Picks and hammers were made from iron that was often of poor quality, requiring constant sharpening and replacement. The handles were typically made from wood and would break frequently under the stress of heavy use. Miners often had to provide their own tools, representing a significant expense for workers who were already living at subsistence levels. A broken pick or shovel could mean lost wages while a replacement was obtained, adding financial stress to the already overwhelming physical demands of the work. Lighting in medieval mines was provided by crude oil lamps, candles or torches, all of which posed fire hazards and provided inadequate illumination. Miners often worked in near total darkness, relying on touch and sound to guide their efforts. The flickering, uncertain light made it difficult to spot potential hazards such as unstable rock formations or dangerous gas accumulations. Many mining accidents occurred simply because workers could not see well enough to avoid obvious dangers. The health consequences of mining work were severe and cumulative. Miners inevitably developed lung diseases from constantly breathing air filled with rock dust and particles. What we now know as pneumoconiosis, or black lung disease, was endemic among medieval miners, causing progressive breathing difficulties and eventual death by suffocation. The constant inhalation of coal dust turned miners' lungs black and rigid, making each breath a struggle and leading to a slow, agonizing death that could take years to unfold. Beyond respiratory diseases, miners suffered from a host of other health problems directly related to their work environment. The damp, cold conditions underground led to arthritis and joint problems that left many miners crippled by middle age. The repetitive motions required for mining work caused muscle and bone injuries that never properly healed. Cuts and wounds were common and often became infected in the unsanitary conditions underground, leading to serious complications or death from blood poisoning. The psychological toll of mining work was equally devastating, though less well understood in medieval times. The constant fear of death or injury, combined with the isolation and darkness of underground work, led many miners to develop what we would now recognize as severe anxiety and depression. The knowledge that each day could be their last created a fatalistic attitude among many miners who turned to alcohol or other forms of escape to cope with the unbearable stress of their daily existence. Medical care for miners was virtually non-existent in medieval times. Most mining communities were located in remote areas, far from any qualified physicians or hospitals. When miners were injured on the job, they had to rely on whatever folk remedies and primitive first aid were available from their fellow workers. Serious injuries often meant death, as there was no way to provide the kind of surgical intervention or ongoing medical care that might save a critically injured person. The families of miners lived in constant fear and uncertainty. Wives never knew whether their husbands would return home at the end of each shift, and children grew up understanding that their fathers engaged in work that could kill them at any moment. This atmosphere of perpetual anxiety affected entire mining communities, creating a culture of resignation and fatalism that permeated every aspect of daily life. The economic exploitation of miners was systematic and ruthless. Mine owners paid workers as little as possible while extracting maximum value from their labor. Wages were often paid in company scrip rather than actual money, forcing miners to purchase necessities from company stores at inflated prices. This system of debt peonage kept miners trapped in poverty even when they were working regularly, as their wages were insufficient to cover their basic needs and pay off their accumulated debts to their employers. Housing provided by mining companies was typically substandard, consisting of crude barracks or tiny cottages that were overcrowded and poorly maintained. Entire families were often crammed into single rooms with no privacy or adequate sanitation. The company-owned housing was deliberately kept in poor condition as a means of controlling the workforce, since miners who complained about working conditions or wages could be evicted immediately, leaving them and their families homeless. The diet of mining families was severely restricted by their poverty and the remote locations of most mining operations. They subsisted mainly on bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow in small garden plots. Meat was a rare luxury, and many miners suffered from malnutrition that made them more susceptible to disease and injury. The combination of poor nutrition and hazardous working conditions created a vicious cycle of declining health that affected entire generations of mining families. Education was virtually non-existent for the children of miners. Most mining communities had no schools, and even where basic education was available, children were often required to work in the mines from a very young age to help support their families. This lack of education meant that mining families were trapped in their circumstances with no opportunity to escape to better lives. Generations of families would work in the same mines, passing down the dangers and hardships of mining life as an inevitable inheritance. The social isolation of mining communities was profound and damaging. These settlements were often located far from established towns and villages, creating insular communities with little contact with the outside world. This isolation made it difficult for miners to organize for better working conditions or to seek alternative employment. It also meant that mining communities developed their own distinct cultures that were shaped by the constant presence of danger and death. Religious life in mining communities was often dominated by fatalistic beliefs that accepted suffering and early death as God's will. Churches and clergy in mining areas preached resignation and acceptance rather than encouraging miners to demand better treatment from their employers. This religious fatalism served the interests of mine owners by discouraging worker organization and resistance, while providing miners with a framework for coping with their desperate circumstances. The environmental destruction caused by medieval mining operations was extensive and long-lasting. Forests were clear-cut to provide timber for mine supports and fuel for smelting operations, leaving barren landscapes that took decades to recover. Mining waste polluted streams and rivers, killing fish and making water sources unusable for human consumption or agriculture. The air around mining operations was filled with smoke and particulates that made the surrounding areas unfit for other forms of economic activity. Women in mining communities faced particular hardships and dangers. While they typically did not work underground, They were often employed in surface operations such as sorting ore, washing coal, or operating primitive machinery. These jobs exposed them to many of the same health hazards as the underground workers, including respiratory diseases from dust exposure and injuries from dangerous equipment. Additionally, women bore the primary responsibility for maintaining households and raising children under incredibly difficult circumstances, often while dealing with the stress of having husbands and sons working in life-threatening conditions. The legal system provided little protection for miners who were injured or killed on the job. Workers had no recourse against employers who failed to provide safe working conditions, and families of miners killed in accidents received no compensation for their losses. The law generally favored property owners over workers, and miners who attempted to organize for better conditions could face criminal prosecution or violent suppression by authorities acting on behalf of mine owners. Child labor was endemic in medieval mining operations, with children as young as 6 or 7 years old being put to work in various capacities. Besides serving as trappers, children were used to sort ore, carry tools, and perform other tasks that took advantage of their small size and low wage requirements. The physical and psychological damage inflicted on these child workers was severe and permanent, stunting their growth and development, while exposing them to all the hazards of the mining environment. The technology available to medieval miners was primitive and dangerous. Wooden machinery was prone to failure, often with catastrophic results for workers who were operating or standing near it when it broke. The lack of safety features meant that workers were constantly exposed to moving parts, heavy loads, and unstable structures that could cause serious injury or death with little warning. Improvements in mining technology were slow to develop and even slower to be implemented, as mine owners were reluctant to invest in expensive equipment when cheap labor was readily available. Despite all these hardships, mining communities developed strong bonds of mutual support and solidarity. Miners looked out for one another underground, sharing knowledge about dangerous conditions and helping injured co-workers reach safety. Families in mining communities often shared resources and supported one another through times of particular hardship, creating networks of mutual aid that helped people survive in circumstances that would otherwise have been impossible to endure. The cultural legacy of medieval mining communities was complex and enduring. These communities developed their own folk traditions, songs, and stories that reflected the unique challenges and experiences of mining life. Many of these cultural elements survived long after the original mining operations had closed, influencing regional cultures and identities for generations. The solidarity and mutual support that characterized mining communities also contributed to the later development of labor movements and workers' rights organizations. As we consider the lives of medieval miners like Edmund, we must remember that these were not abstract historical figures, but real people who faced unimaginable hardships with courage and determination. Their suffering was not inevitable or natural, but was the result of economic and social systems that prioritize profit over human welfare. The stories of these miners and their families remind us of the importance of protecting workers' rights and ensuring that economic progress does not come at the expense of human dignity and safety. The legacy of medieval mining extends far beyond the extraction of coal and precious metals. It shaped entire regions, influenced the development of technology and industry, and created cultural traditions that persist to this day. But perhaps most importantly, it provides us with sobering lessons about the costs of unchecked economic exploitation and the resilience of human communities in the face of overwhelming adversity. As we drift off to sleep in our comfortable modern world, we might spare a thought for miners like Edmund, whose labors in the darkness helped build the foundations of our industrial civilization, and whose struggles remind us of how far we have come in protecting the dignity and welfare of working people. The medieval mining industry was a world unto itself, one defined by unimaginable hardship, constant danger, and the relentless pursuit of precious metals and minerals that fueled the medieval economy. To understand the true brutality of a miner's existence, we must venture into their dark subterranean realm, where death lurked around every corner and survival was never guaranteed. Picture, if you will, a typical mining operation in the 14th century England. The entrance to the mine yawns before you like the mouth of some primordial beast, its depths shrouded in perpetual darkness. The air that emerges carries with it the acrid smell of sulfur, the dampness of underground rivers, and something else. Something that makes your stomach turn. It is the smell of fear, of sweat, of men who know they may never see daylight again. The miners themselves were a hardy breed, weathered by years of backbreaking labour in conditions that would horrify modern workers. Their faces, permanently stained with coal dust and grime, bore the marks of countless injuries. Missing fingers were common, lost to cave-ins or the crude tools they wielded. Their lungs, blackened by years of breathing in toxic particles, wheezed with every breath. Many developed what they called the black spit, a telltale sign of the lung disease that would eventually claim their lives. The working conditions inside these medieval mines defied comprehension. Tunnels barely wide enough for a man to crawl through snaked deep into the earth, following veins of ore wherever they might lead. The ceiling, often no more than roughly hewn timber and prayer, groaned ominously under the weight of thousands of tons of rock above. Water seeped constantly through the walls, creating treacherous pools and making every surface slippery with mud. Lighting was provided by flickering candles or oil lamps, their feeble glow creating dancing shadows that played tricks on the mind. These same flames posed a constant threat in mines where explosive gases accumulated, invisible and odorless, until the moment they claimed another victim in a fiery blast that could collapse entire sections of the workings. The tools available to these medieval miners were primitive in the extreme. Armed with little more than picks, shovels and hammers, they chipped away at solid rock face by agonizing face. The sound of metal striking stone echoed endlessly through the tunnels, a rhythmic percussion that marked the slow, methodical extraction of ore. When harder rock was encountered, they would build fires against the stone face, heating it until it cracked, then dousing it with cold water to shatter it further. This dangerous technique filled the already toxic air with smoke and steam, making breathing even more difficult. Hauling the extracted ore to the surface was a Herculean task in itself. Heavy wooden buckets, loaded with rocks and dirt, had to be dragged through narrow passages, up steep inclines, and through flooded sections. The miners who performed this backbreaking work, known as haulers, often worked in teams. Their bodies bent double as they struggled with loads that would challenge modern machinery. The constant threat of flooding loomed over every mining operation. Underground streams could burst through weakened walls without warning, sending torrents of water rushing through the tunnels. Many miners drowned in these sudden deluges, their bodies swept away by the current and never recovered. Those who survived such incidents often found themselves trapped for days, slowly dying of thirst and starvation in pockets of air that grew smaller with each passing hour. Cave-ins were perhaps the most feared hazard of all. The medieval understanding of engineering and structural support was rudimentary at best, and mine shafts were often inadequately braced. The weight of the earth above was a constant enemy, pressing down relentlessly, seeking any weakness in the supports. When timbers finally gave way, the collapse was instantaneous and merciless. Miners caught in such disasters were either crushed immediately or trapped in small spaces, slowly suffocating as their air supply dwindled. The social structure within mining communities reflected the broader inequalities of medieval society, but with its own unique brutalities. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the common miners, men who owned nothing but their own labour and were paid a pittance for risking their lives daily. Above them were the skilled miners, those with knowledge of ore identification and tunnel construction, who commanded slightly better wages but faced the same dangers. Overseeing the operations were the mine foremen, often former miners themselves who had survived long enough to gain experience and the trust of the mine owners. These men walked a dangerous line, pressured by their superiors to increase production while responsible for the safety of the men under their command. The mine owners themselves rarely, if ever, set foot underground, content to count their profits while others paid the ultimate price for their wealth. The families of miners lived in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing if their husband, father, or son would return home at the end of each day. Women in mining communities bore the additional burden of maintaining households on meager wages while constantly preparing for the possibility of widowhood. Children grew up knowing that their fathers worked in a place where death was an everyday occurrence, and many were destined to follow in their footsteps, perpetuating the cycle of danger and hardship. The health consequences of mining work extended far beyond immediate injuries and deaths. The constant inhalation of dust and toxic fumes led to a variety of respiratory ailments that shortened lives and made every breath a struggle. Miners developed distinctive coughs that racked their bodies and left them spitting blood. Their joints, stressed by years of working in cramped conditions and hauling heavy loads, became arthritic and painful. Many walked with permanent stoops from years of working in low tunnels. The psychological toll was equally devastating. The constant darkness, the ever-present danger, and the claustrophobic conditions took their toll on the human spirit. Many miners developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of anxiety and depression. They jumped at sudden sounds, had difficulty sleeping, and often turned to alcohol as a means of coping with their daily terror. The economic realities of mining in medieval times created a vicious cycle of exploitation. Miners were typically paid by the amount of ore they extracted, creating pressure to work longer hours and take greater risks. Safety measures, such as they were, cost time and money that reduced productivity. Mine owners had little incentive to invest in better equipment or safer practices when miners were easily replaceable and had no legal recourse for injuries or deaths. The seasonal nature of some mining operations added another layer of hardship. Surface mining and quarrying could only be done when weather permitted, leaving miners without income during harsh winter months. Underground mining continued year-round, but access roads might become impassable, cutting off supplies and making rescue impossible in case of emergency. The environmental impact of medieval mining was severe and long-lasting. Entire hillsides were carved away in the search for ore, leaving barren landscapes that would take generations to recover. Streams and rivers were polluted with runoff from mining operations, killing fish and contaminating water supplies for miles downstream. The smoke from smelting operations filled the air with toxic fumes that poisoned both workers and nearby residents. Religious beliefs provided some comfort to miners, but also added to their burdens. The church taught that their suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, encouraging acceptance of dangerous conditions rather than efforts to improve them. At the same time, miners were expected to contribute to the church despite their meager incomes, and time spent in religious observance was time not spent earning wages. The technology available to medieval miners was laughably inadequate for the tasks they faced. Ventilation systems consisted of little more than strategically placed holes that might or might not provide fresh air to the working areas. Pumping water from flooded mines required teams of men working in shifts to operate primitive hand pumps or bucket brigades. The lack of accurate surveying techniques meant that miners often worked blind, following ore veins without knowing where they led or what hazards lay ahead. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval miners developed a strong sense of camaraderie and mutual dependence. They knew that their survival often depended on their fellow workers, and bonds forged in the depths of the earth were stronger than those formed in the light of day. They developed their own customs, traditions, and even superstitions that helped them cope with the uncertainties of their profession. The legacy of medieval mining practices extended far beyond the Middle Ages, establishing patterns of exploitation and environmental destruction that would persist for centuries. The willingness of society to sacrifice the health and lives of workers for economic gain became deeply ingrained in industrial practices. The communities that grew up around mining operations often became trapped in cycles of poverty and dependence that lasted for generations. As we reflect on the harsh realities faced by medieval miners, we gain a deeper appreciation for the tremendous human cost of the metals and minerals that underpinned medieval civilization. Every piece of silver, every tool forged from iron, every building constructed with stone represented the sweat, blood, and often the lives of men who labored in darkness so that others might prosper in the light. Their story is one of human endurance in the face of unimaginable adversity, a testament to the strength of the human spirit even under the most brutal conditions. The medieval mining industry stands as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both remarkable achievement and callous indifference to human suffering. In understanding their struggles, we honor the memory of those who paid the ultimate price for the foundations of our modern world. The perilous descent, mining's most dangerous frontier. In the depths beneath the medieval estates, where the wealthy lords collected their rents and the peasants worked their fields, lay an even darker world, one that claimed more lives per day than battlefield combat: the mines. Here, in these suffocating underground labyrinths, men like Thomas the Iron Seeker descended each morning, knowing that many would not see another sunset. Thomas had been working the iron mines of Yorkshire for 7 years, longer than most men lasted in this profession. His face bore the telltale signs of his trade, blackened creases around his eyes from the constant dust, a persistent cough that rattled his chest, and scars across his hands from countless encounters with sharp stone and jagged metal. At 28, he was considered an elder among the miners, though by any other measure, he was still a young man. The descent into the mine began before dawn, when the air above ground still held the crisp promise of morning dew. Thomas would gather with his fellow miners at the mouth of the shaft, a gaping wound in the earth that seemed to exhale the very breath of hell itself. The wooden ladder that led down into the darkness was slick with moisture and worn smooth by thousands of desperate hands seeking purchase in the dim light of flickering torches. As Thomas began his descent, the familiar weight of dread settled in his stomach. The ladder groaned under the collective weight of the men climbing down, its rungs sometimes giving way without warning, sending miners plummeting into the abyss below. Those who survived such falls were often maimed beyond repair, their broken bodies hauled to the surface only to face a slow death from internal injuries that no medieval healer could mend. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with moisture and the acrid smell of burning coal and human sweat. By the time Thomas reached the bottom, some 100 feet below ground, the torch flames barely flickered in the oxygen-starved atmosphere. The mine extended in multiple directions from this central shaft, a maze of tunnels carved out by generations of desperate men following veins of precious metal through solid rock. Water was perhaps the most immediate threat Thomas faced each day. The mines constantly flooded, with groundwater seeping through cracks in the stone walls and pooling in the lower tunnels. Primitive pumping systems, operated by teams of men working in shifts, fought a losing battle against the relentless infiltration. When these systems failed, as they often did, entire sections of the mine would flood within hours, trapping miners who had ventured too deep into the workings. Thomas had seen men swept away by sudden torrents of muddy water, their screams echoing through the tunnels as they were carried into the flooded depths. Others had been found days later, their bodies bloated and decomposing in stagnant pools, their families left to wonder whether they had drowned quickly or spent their final hours in terrified agony, clawing at stone walls in the pitch darkness. The tools available to medieval miners were crude and dangerous. Thomas carried a heavy iron pick, its wooden handle worn smooth by his calloused hands. The pick was his primary weapon against the unyielding rock face, but it was also a constant source of injury. The force required to break through stone often caused the pick to slip or rebound unexpectedly, resulting in deep gashes to arms and legs. Worse still, metal fragments from the pick itself would sometimes break off and embed themselves in a miner's flesh, leading to infections that could prove fatal. Fire was another ever-present danger in these underground chambers. The wooden support beams that held up the tunnel ceilings were dry and combustible, and the open flames of torches provided the only source of light. A single spark in the wrong place could ignite a conflagration that would race through the mine's passages faster than any man could run. Thomas had witnessed such fires, had seen men emerge from the tunnels with their hair and clothing ablaze, their skin hanging in charred strips from their bodies. But perhaps more terrifying than fire was the invisible killer that stalked every miner, the poisonous gases that accumulated in poorly ventilated shafts. These gases, which the miners called choke damp and fire damp, could strike without warning. A miner might be working normally one moment and collapse unconscious the next, his lungs filled with carbon monoxide or methane. Those who survived such exposure often suffered permanent damage to their minds and bodies, becoming vacant shells of their former selves. Thomas had learned to watch for the warning signs, the way candle flames would dim or change color, the sudden dizziness that preceded unconsciousness, the sweet smell that sometimes accompanied deadly gas leaks. But even with this knowledge, the gases remained largely unpredictable. Ventilation in medieval mines was primitive at best, relying on natural air currents and crude bellows systems that often failed to provide adequate fresh air to the deepest workings. The physical toll of mining work was devastating. Men worked in cramped conditions, often crawling on their hands and knees through passages barely wide enough for a human body. The constant stooping and crouching led to permanent spinal deformities, while the repetitive motion of swinging picks caused severe joint damage. Thomas's shoulders ached constantly, and his back had developed a permanent hunch that marked him as clearly as any brand. The rock dust that filled the air with every blow of the pick was perhaps the most insidious threat of all. This fine particulate matter coated the miner's lungs, building up over months and years until breathing became a labored struggle. The condition, which would later be known as pneumoconiosis or black lung disease, was virtually universal among miners who survived long enough to develop it. Thomas could hear it in his own breathing, the wet, rattling sound that grew worse each month, the shortness of breath that came with even mild exertion. Cave-ins were a constant terror that haunted every miner's thoughts. The wooden supports that held up tunnel ceilings were often inadequate for the weight of rock and earth above. These supports would rot in the damp conditions, or simply snap under excessive pressure, bringing tons of stone crashing down without warning. Thomas had been trapped by smaller cave-ins on 3 separate occasions, once spending 8 hours pinned beneath fallen timbers while rescue crews dug frantically to reach him. The psychological impact of such constant danger was profound. Many miners developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorders. They would start at sudden sounds, have nightmares about being buried alive, and some simply refuse to enter the mines again, choosing poverty over the daily terror of underground work. The mines had a way of breaking men's spirits long before they broke their bodies. Safety equipment was virtually non-existent in medieval mining operations. Miners worked without helmets, relying only on cloth caps that provided no protection against falling rocks. They had no safety ropes or harnesses when working near vertical shafts, No breathing apparatus to filter out deadly dust and gases. No protective eyewear to shield their vision from flying stone chips. A miner's only protection was his experience, his quick reflexes, and whatever divine providence might watch over him in the depths. The work schedule in medieval mines was brutal and unforgiving. Miners typically worked from dawn until dusk, with only brief breaks for meager meals. In winter, this meant descending into the earth in darkness and emerging in darkness, going weeks without seeing natural sunlight. The combination of long hours, dangerous conditions, and poor nutrition left miners exhausted and vulnerable to accidents. Many injuries occurred late in the day when fatigue clouded judgment and slowed reaction times. Medical care for injured miners was primitive and often ineffective. Minor cuts and bruises were treated with whatever folk remedies were available: herbs, poultices, and prayers. More serious injuries often meant permanent disability or death. A broken leg in a mine collapse might heal crooked, leaving a man unable to work. Burns from mine fires frequently became infected, leading to slow, agonizing deaths from blood poisoning. The miners had no understanding of antiseptics or proper wound care, and many died from injuries that would be easily treatable today. The social isolation experienced by mining communities was particularly harsh. Mining settlements were often located in remote areas near the mineral deposits, far from larger towns and cities. This isolation meant that miners and their families had little contact with the outside world and few opportunities for economic advancement or social mobility. The mining camps themselves were rough, lawless places where violence and desperation were commonplace. Women in mining communities faced their own set of challenges. While they typically did not work underground, they were responsible for maintaining households under extremely difficult conditions. They had to cope with the constant uncertainty of whether their husbands and sons would return home each evening. Many became widows at young ages, left to raise children in poverty with few options for support. Some women worked at the surface of mines, sorting ore or operating primitive washing equipment, exposing them to many of the same health hazards as the men below ground. Children in mining families often began working at very young ages, sometimes as early as 7 or 8 years old. They were used as trappers, sitting alone in dark tunnels for hours at a time, opening and closing ventilation doors as mine carts passed through. These children developed rickets from lack of sunlight, suffered from malnutrition, and often died from accidents or exposure to toxic gases. Education was virtually non-existent in mining communities, trapping families in cycles of poverty and dangerous work. The economic exploitation of miners was systematic and merciless. Mine owners paid workers in company scrip rather than real money, forcing them to purchase necessities at company stores that charged inflated prices. This system ensured that miners remained perpetually indebted to their employers, unable to leave even when conditions became unbearable. Miners who were injured on the job received no compensation and were simply replaced by desperate men willing to risk their lives for meager wages. The environmental destruction caused by medieval mining operations was extensive and long-lasting. Entire hillsides were stripped away in pursuit of surface minerals, leaving barren landscapes that could not support agriculture or other forms of life. Rivers and streams were contaminated with mining waste, poisoning water supplies for miles downstream. The noise and pollution from mining operations drove away wildlife and made surrounding areas uninhabitable for other forms of economic activity. Yet despite all these hardships, mining communities developed strong bonds of mutual support and solidarity. Miners looked out for one another in the dangerous underground environment, sharing food when times were hard and caring for the families of those who died in accidents. They developed their own cultural traditions, songs, and stories that helped them cope with the constant stress and danger of their work. These communities, forged in the crucible of shared suffering, often displayed remarkable resilience and loyalty. The legacy of medieval mining extends far beyond the extraction of precious metals and coal. These early mining operations established patterns of labor exploitation and environmental destruction that would persist for centuries. The techniques developed by medieval miners, crude as they were, laid the groundwork for the industrial mining operations that would follow. But perhaps most importantly, the suffering endured by these forgotten workers reminds us of the human cost behind the material prosperity that built medieval civilization. The miners like Thomas, who descended into the earth each day, were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were simply men trying to survive in a world that offered them few alternatives. Their courage was not the bold courage of knights and warriors, but the quiet, desperate courage of those who face death daily for the sake of their families. Their names are largely lost to history, but their sacrifice helped build the foundations of the world we know today. In honoring their memory, we acknowledge the debt we owe to those who labored and died in darkness so that others might live in light. Here's part 8 of the Medieval Miner's script, continuing from where the series left off. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of the miners' quarters, the harsh reality of another day in the depths awaited. The sound of pickaxes against stone had barely ceased from the previous shift when the next wave of workers began their descent into the earth's bowels. For the medieval miner, there was no respite, no moment of peace from the relentless cycle of extraction that defined their existence. The mining settlements that dotted the landscape were grim testimonies to human endurance. Built hastily around newly discovered veins of ore, these communities sprang up like mushrooms after rain, only to wither and die when the earth's treasures were exhausted. The miners and their families lived in ramshackle wooden structures that offered little protection from the elements. Entire families crowded into single rooms, sharing their meager space with rats, fleas, and the ever-present dampness that seemed to seep into their very bones. The social hierarchy within these mining communities was as rigid as the rock they carved. At the top sat the mine owners, wealthy merchants or nobles who rarely set foot in the settlements they controlled. Below them were the overseers, hard men who had clawed their way up from the ranks of common miners through brutality and cunning. These were the taskmasters who drove the workers ever deeper, ever harder, caring little for the human cost of their ambitions. The skilled miners formed a middle tier, men who had survived long enough to master the dangerous art of following veins and reading the subtle signs that warned of impending collapse. These weathered veterans commanded slightly better wages and a grudging respect from their peers. They knew which timber would hold and which would snap, could smell the dangerous gases before they became deadly, and possessed the hard-won wisdom that meant the difference between life and death in the underground labyrinth. Below them toiled the common labourers, men whose only qualification was the desperate need for work. They hauled the heavy baskets of ore, cleared away debris, and performed the countless back-breaking tasks that kept the mines functioning. Their lives were measured not in years, but in the gradual accumulation of injuries and the slow poisoning of their lungs. At the very bottom of this harsh hierarchy were the children. Boys as young as 8 or 9 were sent into the narrowest passages where adult bodies could not fit, crawling through spaces barely wider than their small frames to reach pockets of ore. These child miners lived in a world of perpetual darkness, their stunted growth a testament to the malnutrition and poisonous air that surrounded them. Many never saw their 15th birthday, their young bodies broken by the relentless demands of the earth. The work itself followed a rhythm as old as human greed. Before sunrise, the miners would gather at the shaft entrance, their faces already blackened with coal dust and resignation. The descent into the mine was a journey into another realm, a place where the normal rules of human existence seemed suspended. The wooden ladders that led downward creaked ominously under the weight of the workers, and more than one miner had plummeted to his death when rotten rungs gave way beneath him. Once in the depths, the miners would light their small oil lamps or candles, creating pools of flickering illumination in the vast darkness. The air was thick and oppressive, heavy with moisture and the acrid smell of burning sulfur. Every breath was a struggle, and the constant threat of poisonous gases meant that a single careless moment could spell doom for an entire work crew. The mining techniques of the medieval period were primitive by modern standards, relying primarily on hand tools and brute force. Miners would use picks and hammers to chip away at the rock face, following veins of ore that snaked through the earth like metallic serpents. The work was exhausting, requiring hours of repetitive motion that left shoulders aching and hands raw and bleeding. When the rock proved too hard for hand tools, miners would resort to fire setting, a dangerous technique that involved building fires against the rock face to heat it, then dousing it with cold water to cause it to crack. This method filled the already toxic air with additional smoke and fumes, creating conditions that would be considered lethal by any modern safety standard. The constant exposure to these noxious vapors left miners gasping and wheezing, their lungs slowly deteriorating with each passing day. The dreaded miner's cough became as much a part of their identity as the dirt under their fingernails, a constant reminder of the price they paid for the metal that enriched their masters. Water was another constant enemy in the medieval mine. Groundwater seeped through cracks in the rock, creating pools and streams that made footing treacherous and tools rust within days. The primitive drainage systems of the time could do little to combat the relentless intrusion of moisture, and many mines were simply abandoned when the water table rose too high. Miners often worked knee-deep in icy water, their feet developing painful sores and infections that never properly healed. The extraction of ore was only the beginning of the miner's ordeal. Once the precious metal was freed from the rock, it had to be transported to the surface through narrow, winding passages. This back-breaking labor fell primarily to the younger miners and the occasional pack animal that could be coaxed into the depths. Heavy baskets of ore were strapped to their backs or loaded onto crude sledges that had to be dragged through the maze-like tunnels. The journey to the surface was fraught with danger. Tunnel collapses were an ever-present threat, and the weight of the ore made it difficult to move quickly when disaster struck. Many miners met their end, crushed beneath tons of rock and metal, their bodies becoming part of the very mines they had worked so desperately to empty. Above ground, the ore underwent processing that was scarcely less dangerous than its extraction. Primitive smelting furnaces belched toxic smoke into the air, creating clouds of lead and mercury vapor that poisoned entire communities. The workers who tended these furnaces lived abbreviated lives, their bodies slowly succumbing to heavy metal poisoning that manifested in tremors, madness, and eventual death. The economic structure of medieval mining was designed to extract maximum profit from human misery. Miners were typically paid by the amount of ore they produced, creating a vicious incentive to take ever greater risks in pursuit of better wages. This piece rate system meant that safety became a luxury that few could afford, as time spent on precautions was time not spent earning the meager coins that kept their families fed. Many miners found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt to their employers. The company store, a fixture of mining communities, sold essential supplies at inflated prices, often the only source of food and tools for miles around. Miners who fell behind on their payments found their wages garnished, creating a spiral of debt that could persist for generations. Entire families became bonded to the mines, their children destined to follow their fathers into the earth's depths with no hope of escape. The isolation of mining communities created a unique culture of solidarity and despair. Cut off from the outside world by distance and the stigma of their profession, miners developed their own customs and superstitions. They They spoke in hushed tones of the spirits that supposedly inhabited the depths, malevolent entities that could cause tunnel collapses or led workers astray in the darkness. These beliefs served as both explanation and comfort in a world where death could strike without warning or apparent cause. Religious faith took on a particular intensity in the mining communities. Faced daily with the possibility of sudden death, miners clung to whatever spiritual comfort they could find. Makeshift shrines appeared in the tunnels, crude crosses carved into rock faces where fellow workers had perished. The patron saints of miners were invoked with desperate fervor, their protection sought against the countless dangers that lurked in every shadow. The impact of mining on the surrounding landscape was as devastating as its effect on human life. Entire forests were stripped bare to provide timber for mine supports and fuel for smelting furnaces. Rivers ran red with the runoff from processing operations, killing fish and poisoning the water supply for miles downstream. The very earth itself was scarred and pitted, left looking like a battlefield where humanity had waged war against nature itself. Women in mining communities faced their own particular hardships. While they were generally excluded from the underground work, they bore the burden of maintaining households under the most challenging conditions. With limited access to clean water and fresh food, they struggled to keep their families healthy while dealing with the constant anxiety of wondering whether their husbands and sons would return from the depths each day. Many women supplemented their family's income by taking in washing or mending for the miners, work that exposed them to the same toxic dusts and chemicals that plagued the men underground. Others worked in the surface operations, sorting ore and tending the furnaces, their health sacrificed to the same inexorable demands for production that consumed their male counterparts. The children of mining families knew no childhood as we would understand it. From the moment they could walk, they were put to work in whatever capacity their small bodies allowed. The lucky ones might tend to household chores or help with the ore sorting, but many found themselves descending into the mines before they had lost their milk teeth. Education was a luxury that few could afford, and literacy rates in mining communities were among the lowest in medieval society. Medical care in these isolated settlements was virtually non-existent. The few physicians who might venture into mining territory were often little more than charlatans, peddling useless remedies to desperate families. More commonly, miners relied on folk healers and the accumulated wisdom of their communities, treatments that were as likely to harm as to help. Serious injuries or illnesses were often seen as death sentences, and many miners simply worked until they collapsed, their bodies finally unable to endure another day in the depths. The seasonal rhythms that governed most medieval life were largely absent from mining communities. The work continued regardless of weather or daylight, driven by the relentless demands of extraction and the need to service debts and obligations. Miners emerged from their shifts to find the world above had changed while they toiled in darkness, seasons passing almost unnoticed in their subterranean realm. Despite the overwhelming hardships, miners developed a fierce pride in their dangerous profession. They possessed skills and knowledge that were essential to medieval society, understanding the earth's secrets in ways that no farmer or craftsman could match. This expertise, hard-won through years of suffering and loss, became a source of identity and dignity in a world that otherwise offered them little respect. The mining communities also fostered a spirit of mutual aid that was essential for survival. When disaster struck, as it inevitably did, the entire community would mobilize to rescue trapped miners or care for the families of the dead. These bonds of solidarity, forged in the crucible of shared suffering, created relationships that transcended the usual social divisions of medieval society. As night fell over the mining settlements, the exhausted workers would gather in whatever taverns or communal spaces their communities could support. Here, they would share their meager meals and stronger drink, finding temporary escape from their harsh reality in the company of those who understood their struggles. Songs would be sung, stories told, and for a few precious hours, the weight of their burdens might lift slightly. But always, the minds waited. In the morning, the cycle would begin anew, as it had for generations, and would continue for generations more. The medieval miner's legacy was written not in grand monuments or heroic tales, but in the slow accumulation of suffering that made possible the wealth and advancement of others. Their sacrifice, largely unrecognized and unremembered, formed the foundation upon which medieval civilization built its dreams of prosperity and power. The darkness of the mines was more than just the absence of light. It was a metaphor for the place these workers occupied in the consciousness of their society, laboring in obscurity while others basked in the wealth their suffering created. Yet in that darkness, they found ways to preserve their humanity, to care for one another, and to endure with a dignity that no amount of hardship could entirely extinguish. Here's part 9 of the 12-part script for why life was harsh for medieval miners. History for sleep. The dangers that haunted medieval miners extended far beyond the immediate threats of cave-ins and toxic gases. Perhaps most insidious was the slow, creeping destruction that the work wrought upon their bodies over time. The very act of mining, day after day, year after year, transformed these men into living monuments to human endurance and suffering. Consider the hands of a miner like Thomas, who had worked the copper mines of Wales for nearly 2 decades. His fingers, once nimble enough to craft small wooden toys for his children, had become gnarled and twisted, permanently stained green from the copper ore he handled daily. The metal had seeped so deeply into his skin that no amount of scrubbing could remove it. His fingernails had thickened and yellowed, split and cracked from countless encounters with rough stone and metal tools. Each finger bore the scars of cuts and burns, creating a roadmap of pain across his weathered hands. But it was not merely his hands that bore the marks of his profession. Thomas's back had curved into a permanent stoop from years of crawling through low tunnels and hunching over his work. His shoulders had rounded forward, creating a silhouette that immediately identified him as a man of the mines. When he walked through the village on market days, children would point and whisper about the bent man with the green fingers, not understanding that his deformity was the price of their community's survival. The respiratory ailments that plagued miners were perhaps the most cruel of all afflictions. The dust that filled the air in every mineshaft was not merely an inconvenience, but a slow poison that accumulated in the lungs over time. Edmund, working alongside Thomas in those same Welsh mines, had developed what the miners called the black cough. It started as a simple irritation, a tickle in the throat that could be ignored during the day's labour. But as months turned to years, the cough deepened and darkened. Edmund would wake each morning to fits of violent coughing that left him gasping for air, his face flushed red with the effort. The sputum he expelled was black as coal, flecked with traces of the very ore he spent his days extracting. His breathing had become laboured and wheezing, each inhalation a conscious effort rather than the automatic function it should have been. On cold mornings, the sound of his breathing could be heard throughout his small cottage, a rattling wheeze that spoke of lungs slowly filling with stone dust and metal particles. The physical toll was matched by the psychological burden that miners carried. The constant awareness of mortality, the daily descent into what many considered the very bowels of the earth, created a unique form of mental anguish. Many miners spoke of the dreams that haunted their sleep, visions of being buried alive or trapped in endless tunnels that led nowhere. Some developed an almost supernatural fear of enclosed spaces outside the mine, unable to sleep in rooms with low ceilings or feel comfortable in the small village church during Sunday services. There was also the peculiar madness that seemed to affect some miners who worked too long in the deepest shafts. They would speak of hearing voices in the darkness, of seeing faces in the rock walls that seemed to watch and follow their movements. Some claimed to hear the mountain itself speaking to them, warning of dangers or promising riches just beyond the next wall of stone. The village priest dismissed these as the ravings of men whose minds had been addled by bad air and exhaustion, but the miners themselves knew better. They understood that the earth had its own spirit, its own consciousness, that revealed itself only to those who spent their lives in its depths. The social isolation experienced by mining families was another form of suffering that outsiders rarely understood. Mining communities were often located in remote areas, far from the main centers of civilization. This isolation was both practical and social. Practically, mines were established wherever valuable deposits were found, regardless of the convenience of location. Socially, mining families found themselves set apart from agricultural communities by the nature of their work and the physical marks it left upon them. In many villages, miners were viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Their blackened faces and hands, their persistent coughs, and their stories of underground dangers marked them as different from farmers and craftsmen. Some villagers believed that miners were cursed, that their work in the depths of the earth had somehow contaminated them spiritually as well as physically. This superstition was reinforced by the high rates of injury and death among miners, which seemed to suggest divine displeasure with their profession. The economic exploitation of miners was systematic and ruthless. Mine owners, often wealthy merchants or nobles who never set foot in the tunnels themselves, structured payment systems that kept workers perpetually indebted and dependent. The truck system was particularly pernicious. Instead of paying miners in coin, owners would provide credit at company stores where prices were inflated far beyond market rates. A miner might work for weeks only to find that his earnings barely covered the cost of basic necessities purchased from the company store. Tools and equipment were often rented to miners at exorbitant rates rather than provided as part of their employment. A pickaxe or shovel that might cost a few pennies to manufacture would be rented for several times that amount over the course of a month. Candles, essential for working in the darkness, were sold at prices that consumed a significant portion of a miner's daily wage. Even the wooden supports used to shore up tunnel walls were charged to the miners, creating the perverse situation where workers had to pay for their own safety equipment. Housing provided by mine owners was typically substandard, consisting of cramped, poorly built structures that housed multiple families in conditions that would have been considered inadequate for livestock. These company houses were often located as close as possible to the mine entrance, meaning that families lived in the constant shadow and dust of the mining operation. The air around these settlements was thick with particulates from the mines, ensuring that even children and women who never entered the tunnels suffered from respiratory problems. The diet of mining families was severely restricted by their poverty and isolation. The physical demands of mining required substantial nutrition, but miners typically subsisted on the cheapest available foods. Bread made from inferior grains, thin gruel, and occasional scraps of preserved meat constituted the bulk of their diet. Fresh vegetables and fruits were rare luxuries, available only during brief seasons or on special occasions. This poor nutrition made miners more susceptible to disease and slowed their recovery from injuries. Malnutrition was particularly devastating for children in mining families. Many showed signs of rickets and other deficiency diseases, their growth stunted by inadequate food and the polluted environment in which they lived. Child mortality rates in mining communities were significantly higher than in agricultural areas, with many families losing half or more of their children before they reached adulthood. The seasonal nature of some mining operations added another layer of uncertainty to miners' lives. Weather conditions could make certain mines inaccessible for months at a time, leaving families without income during these periods. Even in mines that operated year-round, production might be suspended due to flooding, structural collapses, or depletion of easily accessible ore. During these interruptions, mining families faced starvation unless they could find alternative sources of income or support. The lack of medical care in mining communities meant that injuries and illnesses that might have been treatable elsewhere became life-threatening conditions. Broken bones healed poorly without proper setting, leaving miners permanently disabled. Infections that could have been cured with proper treatment became systemic and often fatal. The harsh working conditions and poor living situations created a cycle where miners became increasingly frail and susceptible to new ailments, even as they were forced to continue working to support their families. Women in mining communities faced particular hardships. While they typically did not work in the mines themselves, they bore the burden of maintaining households under extremely difficult conditions. They had to stretch meager resources to feed and clothe their families, care for injured husbands and sons, and often take on additional work to supplement family income. Many mining wives worked as washerwomen, seamstresses, or food vendors, adding their small earnings to the family's survival fund. The constant fear that hung over mining families was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of their existence. Every morning, when the men descended into the mines, their wives and children faced the possibility that they might not return. The sound of the warning bell that signaled an accident in the mines could strike terror into an entire community, as families rushed to learn whether their loved ones were among the victims. This perpetual anxiety took its toll on family relationships and community bonds. The stress of living with constant danger and poverty created tensions that manifested in various ways. Domestic violence was common in mining communities, as men struggling with pain, fear, and frustration took out their emotions on those closest to them. Alcoholism provided a temporary escape from the harsh realities of mining life, but it also consumed resources that families could not afford to lose and often made difficult situations worse. Despite these overwhelming challenges, mining families developed remarkable resilience and solidarity. They created support networks that helped them survive the worst hardships. When a miner was killed or seriously injured, the community would rally to support his family, sharing what little they had to ensure that widows and orphans did not starve. These informal welfare systems were essential for survival in communities where formal assistance was non-existent. The cultural traditions that emerged from mining communities reflected both their hardships and their strength. Songs and stories passed down through generations told of heroic miners who sacrificed themselves to save their comrades, of the spirits that supposedly dwelt in the depths of the earth, and of the hope for better times that sustained families through their darkest hours. These traditions helped create a sense of identity and purpose that transcended the immediate suffering of daily life. Religious faith played a complex role in mining communities. Many miners and their families found comfort in the belief that their suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next. They attended church services when possible and participated in religious festivals that provided brief respites from their labors. However, some questioned why a benevolent God would allow such suffering to exist, and this theological struggle added another dimension to their psychological burden. The education of children in mining families was severely limited. Most could not afford to send their children to school, and many needed their children's labor to supplement family income. As a result, literacy rates in mining communities were extremely low, and children typically followed their parents into the mines as soon as they were physically capable of doing the work. This perpetuated the cycle of poverty and limited opportunities for social mobility. The environmental destruction caused by medieval mining operations affected entire regions for generations. Strip mining and open pit operations left landscapes scarred and barren. The processing of ores often involved techniques that contaminated soil and water sources with toxic substances. Mercury, used in gold extraction, poisoned rivers and streams, killing fish and making water unsafe for consumption. Lead mining operations left behind waste, that continued to leach toxic substances into the environment long after the mines were abandoned. These environmental impacts had direct consequences for the health of mining communities. Children playing in areas contaminated by mining waste were exposed to toxic substances that caused developmental problems and lifelong health issues. Families who relied on local water sources found themselves consuming water tainted with heavy metals and other dangerous compounds. The dust and particulates from mining operations settled on crops and pastures, contaminating the food supply and affecting livestock. The technological limitations of medieval mining meant that operations were extraordinarily wasteful and dangerous. Without proper ventilation systems, miners worked in atmospheres that were often barely breathable. The lack of sophisticated pumping mechanisms meant that mines frequently flooded, drowning workers, or forcing the abandonment of valuable deposits. Primitive lighting systems using candles or oil lamps created constant fire hazards in environments often filled with combustible gases. The tools available to medieval miners were crude and inefficient, requiring enormous amounts of human energy to accomplish tasks that later technology would make relatively simple. Miners spent countless hours chipping away at rock faces with hand tools, their progress measured in inches rather than feet. The physical strain of this work was enormous, and the slow pace meant that miners had to spend long hours underground to extract meaningful quantities of ore. As we consider the complete picture of life for medieval miners and their families, we see a form of human suffering that encompassed every aspect of existence. From the moment they were born into mining communities until their often premature deaths, these individuals faced challenges that tested the very limits of human endurance. Their bodies were broken by dangerous work, their families impoverished by economic exploitation, their communities isolated from the broader world, and their environment poisoned by the very industry that provided their livelihood. Yet through all these hardships, medieval miners demonstrated remarkable courage and resilience. They faced each day knowing the dangers that awaited them underground. Yet they descended into the darkness because their families depended on their labor. They created communities of mutual support in the harshest of circumstances and maintained their humanity in the face of dehumanizing conditions. Their sacrifice provided the raw materials that built medieval civilization, from the iron that forged weapons and tools, to the precious metals that created works of art and symbols of power. The legacy of these medieval miners extends far beyond their immediate historical context. Their struggles laid the foundation for later labor movements that would fight for worker safety, fair wages, and humane working conditions. Their suffering helped demonstrate the need for regulation of dangerous industries and protection of vulnerable workers. Their resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity provides an enduring example of the human capacity to persevere through even the most difficult circumstances. As we drift towards sleep, we might reflect on how the comfortable conditions of our modern lives rest upon the sacrifices of countless individuals like Edmund and Thomas, who gave their health and often their lives to extract the materials that built our civilization. Their stories remind us that progress often comes at a tremendous human cost, and that we owe a debt of gratitude to those who paid that price on our behalf. Here is part 10 of the 12-part script for Why Life Was Harsh for Medieval Miners, History for Sleep. As we have seen, medieval miners like Edmund and Thomas faced relentless hardships that would be unimaginable to us today. Their lives were defined by constant danger, grinding poverty, and the ever-present threat of death lurking in the dark tunnels beneath the earth. Yet even as they endured these brutal conditions, their labor was essential to the functioning of medieval society, providing the precious metals, coal and stone that built cathedrals, minted coins, and heated the homes of the wealthy. The miners' world was one of perpetual darkness, where the only light came from flickering candles that could easily be extinguished by the slightest breeze or dangerous gas. These men descended into the bowels of the earth each morning, knowing they might never see daylight again. Cave-ins were a constant threat, with poorly supported tunnels collapsing without warning, crushing miners beneath tons of rock and earth. The sound of creaking timber was both a comfort and a terror, signaling that the supports were still holding, while simultaneously warning of their potential failure. Edmund had learned to read the signs of the mine, like a sailor reads the sea. The subtle shifts in air pressure that might indicate dangerous gases accumulating in the deeper shafts. The way moisture beaded on the tunnel walls when water was seeping through from underground streams. The particular groan of timber supports that suggested they were nearing their breaking point. This knowledge, passed down from father to son and shared among the mining community, was often the difference between life and death. The extraction of coal and ore required backbreaking labor with primitive tools. Miners worked with simple iron picks, wooden shovels, and their bare hands to claw precious materials from the earth. The work was repetitive and exhausting, requiring them to swing heavy tools for hours on end in cramped spaces where they could barely stand upright. Their bodies bore the permanent marks of their profession, bent backs from years of stooping, scarred hands from sharp rocks and metal tools, and the telltale black dust that seemed to penetrate every pore of their skin. Thomas often worked in tunnels so narrow he had to lie on his side to chip away at the coal face. The position was excruciating, putting tremendous strain on his shoulders and hips, but it was the only way to reach the valuable seams of coal that lay embedded in the rock. He would spend entire days in this position, emerging from the mine with his body so stiff and sore he could barely walk. The constant dampness of the tunnel seeped into his bones, leaving him with aching joints that never seemed to heal properly. Ventilation in medieval mines was primitive at best and non-existent at worst. Fresh air was a luxury that few miners enjoyed, as the technology to circulate air through deep underground passages had not yet been developed. Instead, miners worked in stifling, oxygen-poor environments where toxic gases could accumulate to deadly levels. Fire damp, a mixture of methane and other gases released from coal seams, was particularly dangerous. Odorless and invisible, it could ignite without warning, creating explosions that would tear through mine shafts with devastating force. The miners developed crude methods for detecting these dangerous gases. Canary birds, though not yet widely used in medieval times, were sometimes employed as early warning systems. More commonly, miners would watch their candle flames carefully, noting when they burned differently or went out entirely, which could indicate the presence of dangerous gases. Some experienced miners claimed they could smell or taste certain gases in the air, though this knowledge often came too late to prevent tragedy. Water was another constant enemy in the medieval mine. Underground streams and seasonal flooding turned tunnels into treacherous waterways where miners could easily drown. The primitive drainage systems of the time consisted mainly of hand-dug channels and wooden troughs that frequently became blocked or overwhelmed. During heavy rains, mines would flood rapidly, trapping workers underground. Even when the water levels were manageable, the constant dampness created ideal conditions for disease and infection. Edmund remembered the terrible winter when the mine where his brother worked was flooded by an underground spring. The water rose so quickly that several miners were trapped in the deeper shafts. Rescue efforts were mounted, but the primitive pumping equipment of the time could not remove water fast enough. By the time the tunnels were drained weeks later, the bodies recovered showed the horrible reality of what it meant to be trapped underground when the waters rose. The social structure within mining communities reflected the harsh realities of their profession. Experienced miners commanded respect and slightly better wages, but even they lived in poverty by modern standards. Apprentice miners, often young boys, worked for almost nothing while learning the dangerous trade. These children, some as young as 10 or 12, were used for tasks that required small size, such as crawling through narrow passages or operating simple ventilation systems. The mortality rate among these young apprentices was horrifically high. Mining families lived in small, cramped houses near the mine entrances, their lives revolving entirely around the rhythms of underground work. Women in these communities faced their own hardships, often working as coal washers or ore sorters, while managing households and raising children who might never live to see adulthood. The constant anxiety of wondering whether their husbands and sons would return safely from each shift took a tremendous psychological toll on these families. The economic exploitation of miners was systematic and ruthless. Most miners were bound to their lords through various forms of feudal obligation, meaning they could not simply leave to seek better conditions elsewhere. They were paid in company tokens that could only be used at company stores, where prices were inflated and quality was poor. This system, known as the truck system, ensured that miners remained in perpetual debt to their employers, unable to accumulate enough resources to escape their circumstances. Medical care for miners was virtually non-existent. Injuries sustained in the mines were often treated with folk remedies or left to heal on their own. The constant inhalation of coal dust and other particulates led to what we now know as pneumoconiosis or black lung disease, though medieval people had no understanding of this condition. Miners would gradually develop severe breathing problems, chronic coughs, and eventually suffocate as their lungs filled with scar tissue and accumulated debris. Thomas had watched his father slowly waste away from what the miners called the Black Death of the lungs. The older man's breathing had become increasingly labored over the years, his coughs producing black phlegm that spoke to the accumulation of coal dust in his respiratory system. In his final months, he could barely walk across the room without gasping for air, his once strong body reduced to a shadow of its former self. There was no treatment available, no relief from the suffering that was simply accepted as the inevitable fate of those who spent their lives underground. The psychological impact of mining life was perhaps as devastating as the physical toll. The constant threat of death, the claustrophobic working conditions, and the grinding poverty created a sense of hopelessness that pervaded mining communities. Many miners turned to alcohol as their only escape from the harsh realities of their existence, though this often led to additional problems, including domestic violence and further impoverishment. Despite these overwhelming hardships, mining communities developed strong bonds of solidarity and mutual support. Miners looked out for one another in the dangerous underground environment, sharing knowledge about safe practices and warning each other of potential hazards. When tragedy struck and a miner was killed or injured, the community would rally to support his family, though their own limited resources meant this assistance was often insufficient. Religious faith provided some comfort to these suffering communities, though it was often mixed with superstition and folklore. Miners developed elaborate rituals and beliefs designed to protect them from the dangers of their work. They would pray to specific saints for protection, carry religious amulets into the mines, and observe various taboos believed to prevent accidents. The church, while offering spiritual comfort, also reinforced the social order that kept miners in their oppressed state, teaching them to accept their suffering as God's will. The mining settlements themselves were often isolated from the broader medieval world, creating insular communities where the harsh realities of underground work shaped every aspect of daily life. These towns and villages grew up around mine entrances, their very existence dependent on the continued extraction of valuable materials from the earth. The landscape around these settlements bore the scars of mining activity, with slag heaps, polluted streams, and denuded hillsides creating an environment of environmental degradation. The contrast between the wealth generated by mining and the poverty of those who did the actual work was stark and painful. The precious metals extracted by miners were transformed into coins that would never touch their hands, jewelry that would never adorn their families, and ornamental objects that decorated the homes of the wealthy. The coal they mined heated grand castles and manor houses, while their own families shivered in poorly constructed hovels. Edmund often reflected on this bitter irony as he hauled loads of silver ore to the surface. Each bucket he carried represented wealth beyond his imagination, yet he would receive only a few copper coins for his day's labor. The silver would be refined and minted into currency that would facilitate trade across Europe, enriching merchants and nobles, while the man who risked his life to extract it from the earth remained in grinding poverty. The long-term health effects of mining work were devastating and irreversible. Beyond the respiratory diseases caused by dust inhalation, miners suffered from a variety of other conditions related to their work environment. The constant moisture and poor hygiene in the mines led to skin diseases and infections. The physical demands of the work caused premature arthritis and joint problems. The stress and poor nutrition weakened immune systems, making miners susceptible to various diseases that swept through their communities. The average lifespan of a medieval miner was significantly shorter than that of people in other occupations. Many died in mining accidents before reaching middle age, while others succumbed to occupational diseases in their 30s and 40s. Those who survived long enough to become too weak for underground work often faced destitution in their final years. As there were no systems of social support for disabled or elderly workers, mining technology in the medieval period was primitive and dangerous, relying heavily on human muscle power and simple tools. The lack of proper engineering knowledge meant that mines were often poorly planned and constructed, with inadequate support systems and no consideration for worker safety. Ventilation systems were crude and ineffective. Lighting was provided by open flames that posed constant fire and explosion risks, and drainage relied on manual labor and gravity rather than mechanical pumps. The seasonal nature of some mining work added another layer of uncertainty to miners' lives. Weather conditions could make certain types of mining impossible, leaving workers without income for extended periods. Spring floods might close mines for weeks or months, while winter conditions could make transportation of materials impossible. These seasonal interruptions meant that mining families had to survive on irregular income, making their already precarious economic situation even more unstable. The social stigma associated with mining work further marginalized these communities. Miners were often viewed with suspicion and disdain by other members of medieval society, seen as dirty, dangerous, and somehow less than human. This prejudice was reinforced by their physical appearance, as the coal dust and grime of their work marked them as belonging to the lowest social class. Even when they left the mines, their scarred hands, bent backs, and persistent coughs identified them as miners, subjecting them to discrimination and exclusion. As the medieval period progressed and demand for coal and metals increased, the pressure on miners to produce more intensified. Longer working hours, deeper mines, and more dangerous extraction methods became the norm as lords and mining companies sought to maximize their profits. The already harsh conditions faced by miners deteriorated further, with safety considerations sacrificed in the pursuit of greater productivity and wealth. The wives and children of miners faced their own unique hardships, living in constant fear for the safety of their loved ones, while struggling to maintain households on meager and irregular incomes. Mining widows were common figures in these communities. Left to raise children alone with no source of support, many were forced into desperate situations, begging for charity or turning to prostitution to survive after losing their primary breadwinner to a mining accident or occupational disease. The environmental impact of medieval mining was severe and long-lasting, though not understood at the time. The techniques used to extract coal and ore contaminated water sources, destroyed vegetation, and left the landscape scarred and polluted. Mining communities were often surrounded by toxic waste and polluted air, contributing to the poor health of residents and making agriculture difficult or impossible in surrounding areas. Despite the overwhelming hardships they faced, medieval miners developed a rich culture of resistance and solidarity that helped them endure their harsh circumstances. Songs, stories, and folklore specific to mining communities provided emotional outlet and cultural identity. These traditions often contained subtle criticisms of the social order and expressions of hope for better conditions, serving as a form of psychological resistance to their oppression. The knowledge and skills required for mining were passed down through generations, creating dynasties of mining families who had little choice but to continue in the dangerous profession. This accumulated wisdom about underground work, while valuable for survival, also trapped families in cycles of poverty and danger from which escape was nearly impossible. Sons followed fathers into the mines, not out of choice, but out of necessity, perpetuating the suffering across generations. The contrast between the romantic image of mining in popular culture and the brutal reality faced by medieval miners could not be more stark. While stories and songs might celebrate the bravery and skill of those who worked underground, the daily experience was one of fear, pain, and gradual physical destruction. The miners themselves understood this contrast all too well, often expressing bitter irony about the gap between their perceived importance and their actual treatment by society. As we reflect on the lives of Edmund, Thomas, and countless other medieval miners whose names have been lost to history, we must remember that their suffering was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of primitive technology or economic necessity. It was the result of a social system that valued the extraction of wealth over human life, that treated workers as expendable resources rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and protection. The legacy of these forgotten miners lives on in the metals that still adorn our museums, the coal that powered early industrial development, and the underground infrastructure that laid the foundation for modern mining techniques. Their sacrifice, largely unrecognized and unrewarded in their own time, contributed to the economic development that would eventually lead to improved working conditions and labor protections for future generations of miners. The harsh reality of medieval mining life serves as a powerful reminder of how far we have come in terms of worker safety, labor rights, and social protections. The dangers that Edmund and Thomas face daily as unavoidable facts of life are now largely preventable through modern technology, safety regulations, and medical knowledge. Yet their story also reminds us that progress is not inevitable, and that the protections we now take for granted were won through centuries of struggle and sacrifice. In the flickering candlelight of medieval mines, among the constant dangers of cave-ins and toxic gases, in the face of poverty and social marginalization, these miners demonstrated a resilience and dignity that speaks to the fundamental strength of the human spirit. Their lives may have been harsh beyond our imagination, but they were not without meaning, purpose, or the quiet heroism of those who endure suffering while continuing to hope for something better. Part 11. The human cost of medieval mining. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow openings of the mine shaft, Thomas felt the familiar ache in his chest, a deep, burning sensation that had grown worse with each passing season underground. The blackened phlegm he coughed up each morning served as a grim reminder of the price his body paid for the coal that warmed the hearths of those above. At 32, Thomas looked like a man of 50, his face gaunt and deeply lined, his once strong frame now bent and withered from years of crawling through passages, barely wide enough for a child. The human toll of medieval mining extended far beyond the immediate dangers of cave-ins and explosions. It was a slow, inexorable grinding down of the human spirit and body, a relentless extraction not just of precious metals and coal, but of life itself. Miners like Thomas and Edmund were not merely workers. They were sacrificial offerings to the insatiable appetite of medieval industry. their shortened lives the hidden cost of the copper that adorned church bells and the iron that forged the weapons of war. In the mining communities scattered across Europe's mountainous regions, the spectre of premature death hung as heavy as the perpetual coal dust in the air. Wives learned to recognize the telltale signs, the gradual weakening of their husbands, the way their breathing became more labored with each passing month, the hollow look that crept into their eyes as their lungs slowly filled with the detritus of their labor. Children grew up expecting to bury their fathers before their 40th birthdays, accepting this grim reality as simply the natural order of their world. The condition that would later be known as pneumoconiosis, or black lung disease, was so common among medieval miners that it was simply considered an inevitable consequence of the trade. Men would joke grimly about mining cough or coal spitter's curse, dark humour serving as their only defence against a fate they knew awaited them all. The progression was always the same. First came the persistent cough, then the shortness of breath, followed by the gradual wasting away as the lungs lost their ability to draw life-sustaining air. But the physical deterioration was only part of the human cost. The psychological toll of spending one's days in darkness, constantly aware that each breath might be one's last, created a unique form of mental anguish. Miners developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of depression and anxiety, irritability, sleeplessness, and a pervasive sense of doom that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth itself. Many turned to ale and wine, not for pleasure, but as the only available medicine for their psychological wounds. The mining families formed tight-knit communities, bound together by shared suffering and mutual dependence. In these settlements, women bore the double burden of caring for their ailing husbands while knowing that their sons would likely follow the same path into the mines. There were few alternatives. Mining towns offered little in the way of other employment, and the skills required for underground work did not easily translate to life above ground. Margaret, the wife of a tin miner in Cornwall, exemplified the quiet heroism of these mining families. Each morning, she would watch her husband William descend into the earth, never certain he would return. She learned to read the signs of mine accidents, the sudden cessation of sounds from below, the panicked shouts of the surface workers, the grim-faced emergence of survivors who had left their comrades buried beneath tons of rock. When William finally succumbed to lung disease at the age of 38, Margaret was left to raise their 4 children alone, knowing that her eldest son would soon take his father's place in the depths. The children of mining families aged quickly, their innocence stolen by the harsh realities of their environment. They learned early that their father's work was dangerous, and that death was a constant companion. Many began working in the mines themselves as young as 8 or 9 years old, initially performing simple tasks like carrying messages or sorting ore, but gradually taking on more dangerous responsibilities as they grew older. These child labourers were particularly vulnerable to the various hazards of mining. Their small size made them useful for accessing narrow passages, but also made them more susceptible to injury and less able to escape when danger struck. The social structure of mining communities reflected the brutal hierarchy of their industry. At the bottom were the common labourers who performed the most dangerous work for the least compensation. Above them were the skilled miners who possessed knowledge of tunnelling techniques and ore extraction. At the top were the mine overseers and managers, who rarely ventured underground themselves, but made the decisions that determined whether the workers below lived or died. The medical knowledge available to treat mining-related injuries and illnesses was primitive at best. Broken bones might be set by the local barber surgeon, but there was little understanding of internal injuries or respiratory diseases. Miners suffering from lung ailments were often told to breathe the vapors from heated herbs or to drink concoctions made from various plants, treatments that provided little more than false hope. The concept that the very air they breathed was slowly killing them was beyond the medical understanding of the time. Perhaps most tragically, the human cost of medieval mining was largely invisible to those who benefited from its products. The nobles who commissioned elaborate metalwork for their castles, the merchants who traded in precious metals, and the craftsmen who forged tools and weapons rarely gave thought to the men who had died to make their prosperity possible. The miners existed in a separate world, literally underground, their suffering hidden from view and their deaths unremarked upon by the broader society. The generational impact of mining was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. Sons followed fathers into the mines not out of choice, but out of necessity. The skills passed down from one generation to the next were not just techniques for extracting ore, but methods for surviving in an environment designed to kill. Fathers taught their sons how to read the subtle signs that warned of impending cave-ins, how to move efficiently through cramped spaces, and how to endure the constant fear that accompanied every descent into darkness. The mining families developed their own traditions and rituals around death and danger. Before entering the mines each day, many miners would say prayers or perform small rituals meant to ensure their safe return. Wives would light candles in windows, creating beacons to guide their husbands home from the underworld. When a miner died, the entire community would gather to mourn, knowing that they were not just grieving for one man, but confronting their own inevitable fate. The economic exploitation inherent in medieval mining meant that the human cost was borne entirely by those least able to afford it. The profits flowed upward to mine owners and investors, while the miners themselves received barely enough compensation to survive. This created a vicious cycle where families remained trapped in mining communities, unable to accumulate enough resources to escape to better opportunities elsewhere. The isolation of many mining communities compounded their suffering. Located in remote mountain regions or deep forests, these settlements were often cut off from the broader world for months at a time. This isolation meant that when disasters struck, whether mining accidents, disease outbreaks, or economic downturns, the communities had little outside support to fall back upon. They were forced to be entirely self-reliant, developing their own methods for dealing with tragedy and loss. As we drift towards sleep, let us remember Thomas and Edmund, Margaret and William, and the countless other forgotten souls who paid the ultimate price for medieval civilization's hunger for the earth's treasures. Their lives, though brief and filled with suffering, were not without meaning. In their quiet endurance, their fierce love for their families, and their stubborn refusal to surrender hope, even in the face of certain doom, they embodied the very best of the human spirit. They remind us that progress often comes at a cost that is borne not by those who benefit most, but by those who have the least choice in the matter. Their legacy lives on, not in the gold and silver they extracted, but in their example of courage in the face of impossible odds, and in the reminder that behind every human achievement lie human sacrifices that must never be forgotten. Through the struggles and hardships we've explored tonight, we've witnessed the extraordinary resilience of medieval miners who descended into darkness each day to eke out their survival. From the dangerous depths of coal mines to the backbreaking labor in stone quarries, these forgotten souls endured conditions that would seem unimaginable to us today. Their lives were marked by constant peril, meager wages, and the ever-present spectre of cave-ins, explosions, and lung disease. Yet through it all, they persevered with a quiet dignity that speaks to the indomitable human spirit. As you drift off to peaceful slumber, may you carry with you the memory of their sacrifice and the knowledge that even in the darkest tunnels, hope somehow found a way to flicker on.